The wind didn't knock. It didn't warn. It simply arrived, a wall of white fury that hit the cabin like something with a grudge. And 11-year-old Clara Whitlock pressed her back against the door, as if her 63 pounds of bone and desperation could hold back a Montana winter. Inside, two babies were crying. Not the loud, demanding cry of children who expected comfort. Something thinner than that. Something that scared her worse than the storm. Her mother had been dead for 4 days. Her father had been gone for 6. The fire had maybe 2 hours left in it, and Clara had already burned the 3 chairs, both stools, and the lid off the wooden chest where her mother kept the extra quilts. She was looking at the bookshelf now, her father's books, the ones he'd hauled 300 miles on a wagon because he said a man without books was just an animal with boots. And she was thinking about how long the spines would burn. She'd crossed the room, picked up the thinnest one, and fed it to the fire without blinking. If you've ever wondered what it would take to break a child, or what it takes to keep one from breaking, then stay with me. This story is going to answer that question in a way you won't forget. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please take a moment and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that cabin. Let's go back to Clara. She had not slept in 2 days. Not really. There were moments, 10 minutes here, 20 there, when her body simply stopped cooperating and she'd jerk awake with her heart hammering, convinced she'd let the fire go out, convinced one of the twins had stopped breathing. She'd lunge to check, find them both still alive in the wooden drawer she'd lined with her mother's underskirts, and then she'd stand there in the dark, shaking until her hands remembered how to be still. Her name was Clara May Whitlock. She was the daughter of Thomas Whitlock, a man who believed in hard work and good books, and the particular stubbornness that settlers needed to survive out here in the mountain valleys of Montana Territory, where the winters came early and stayed mean and didn't care one bit about what you'd planned for spring. Her mother was Ruth Whitlock, who had been soft-voiced and careful, and who had taught Clara to read by age 5 and to bake bread by age 7, and who had laughed, really laughed, from the belly, maybe 3 times in Clara's entire life. But when she did, it sounded like something you'd want to collect and keep in a jar. Ruth Whitlock had died on a Tuesday, 4 days ago now, with a sound that Clara could not describe and would never fully leave her memory. She had died bringing the twins into the world, which was the cruelest kind of trade Clara could imagine. 2 lives arriving at the exact cost of the one that had made them possible. Thomas Whitlock had ridden out 6 days before the birth. He'd seen the signs: Ruth's difficulty walking, the swelling in her ankles, the way she'd stopped eating, and he'd made the call that most frontier fathers made when fear got bigger than practicality. He'd said he was going to ride 2 days north to fetch Doc Harlan from the settlement at Bitterroot Creek, and he'd be back in 4 days at the outside. He'd kissed Ruth's forehead. He'd put his hand on Clara's shoulder and told her she was the most capable girl he'd ever known. And then he'd ridden into the snow. That was 6 days ago. The storm had come on day 3. And Clara had stopped counting sunrises because counting them made the number feel like something accusatory. The twins had been born on Tuesday evening, arriving fast and brutal and terrifying, with Clara playing midwife because there was no one else. She had delivered foals with her father. She had seen calves come into the world. She told herself it was the same. She told herself that while her hands shook so hard she nearly couldn't function, and somehow, impossibly, both babies had arrived breathing, a boy and a girl. She'd wrapped them in the cleanest things she could find and placed them in the wide bottom drawer of her mother's bureau, which she'd pulled close to the fire, and she'd sat on the floor between the drawer and her mother's body, and she'd thought, someone will come tomorrow. Papa will come tomorrow. He hadn't come tomorrow. He hadn't come the day after. And Ruth Whitlock, who had been a private woman who would not have wanted strangers handling her remains, had stayed in that bed for 2 full days while Clara tried to figure out what to do, until finally Clara had wrapped her in the good quilt, the one with the blue squares that Ruth had made herself, and had managed, through something she couldn't explain afterward, to get her mother outside and covered with snow and a piece of the back fence, because the ground was frozen solid 3 feet down and there was no burying anything. She had said nothing over the grave. She didn't know what to say. She'd stood there for maybe 2 minutes, the cold eating through her coat, and then she'd gone back inside because the babies were crying. The boy was louder than the girl. That was the first thing Clara had noticed. He had opinions about things from the very first hour, about being cold, about being hungry, about the general injustice of his situation, and he communicated those opinions at a volume that seemed improbable for something that weighed less than a sack of flour. Clara had named him Henry in her head, after her grandfather, because he had their grandfather's look of permanent indignation. The girl was quieter. That was what scared Clara. Quiet, on a frontier where survival belonged to the loud and the stubborn, was not generally a good sign. The girl ate less than Henry. She slept more. Her color, in the firelight, was not the angry red of her brother's face, but something closer to ash. And when Clara pressed her finger to the baby's palm, the way she'd seen her mother do with newborns to check their grip, the response was weaker than it had been the day before. She had no name for the girl yet. She'd tried a few in her head and none of them had stuck. She found herself thinking of the baby simply as she or the little one, and she didn't examine why she hadn't committed to a name, because she suspected the reason would undo her. The milk situation was a catastrophe. There was a cow, Bessie, a solid old brown and white thing that had given them no trouble since they'd gotten her 3 years back, penned in the small lean-to attached to the cabin. Clara had milked her twice a day since Tuesday, warming the milk by the fire and feeding it to the twins with a clean cloth she'd cut from one of her mother's aprons, dipping it and letting them suckle from the soaked rag. But the last milking had been wrong. Clara had noticed it even before she'd tasted it. There was a smell, faint, but there. Something turned and wrong, and when she'd touched her tongue to the cloth, the sourness had made her stomach turn. She'd checked Bessie and found the cow's back left quarter hot and swollen, which her father had told her meant mastitis, which meant the milk was poisoned. She'd dumped the milk in the snow. She'd stood there watching it disappear into the white and thought, I need to figure this out by tomorrow or we're finished. That had been yesterday. Today she had watered down broth she'd made from the last of the salt pork, cooled and thinned until it was barely more than warm water, and she'd been giving it to the twins on the cloth because she had nothing else. Henry had taken it, furious and unsatisfied, but taking it. The girl had taken almost none. The fire popped and Clara's head snapped up. She'd been sitting on the floor with her back against the bureau drawer, her knees pulled to her chest, and she hadn't meant to let herself drift. She hadn't thought she had. But the fire's sound had pulled her back from something that wasn't quite sleep, but wasn't quite waking either. Both babies were breathing. She checked. Both. She got up and fed the fire 2 more pieces of the bookshelf she'd dismantled that morning, her hands careful, automatic. And then she went to the window and looked out. The storm was doing something different. It wasn't stopping. She didn't think it was stopping, but the character of it had shifted in some way she couldn't name. The sound against the roof was less constant, more intermittent, like something that was deciding whether it still had the energy to be angry. The light outside, what little of it there was, had changed from gray-white to a kind of pewter, which meant afternoon was heading toward evening, which meant another night was coming. She turned from the window. She did not cry. She had cried a great deal the first 2 days, ugly, heaving crying that scared the babies and accomplished nothing, and somewhere on day 3 she had simply run dry. She didn't think this was strength. She thought it was probably a different kind of breaking, the kind that didn't make noise. She went back to the drawer and looked down at the twins. Henry was awake, his dark eyes tracking the light from the fire with that aggrieved expression he'd arrived in the world wearing. The girl was asleep, too still. Clara crouched and put her hand on the baby's chest, held it there, felt the rise and fall, shallow, but there. She pressed her palm a little firmer, just to be sure, just to feel it. "You have to eat," Clara said. Her voice came out strange, rough from disuse, from the days of not having anyone to talk to. "Tomorrow, you have to eat something. I don't know what yet, but something." Henry made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been a complaint about being excluded from the conversation. Clara looked at him. "You too," she said. "Both of you." The firewood was down to 6 pieces. She'd been counting them the way people counted things that couldn't be replaced, obsessively, superstitiously, as if the counting itself might stretch them. 6 pieces. She'd burned the furniture, she'd burned the books, she'd burned the 3 extra fence rails her father had left stacked by the door in case of emergency, because this was an emergency, and she'd been judicious about it. She'd been careful, but careful only slowed down the math. It didn't change it. 6 pieces of firewood. The temperature outside was, she estimated, somewhere around the point where spit froze before it hit the ground. She knew from her father's teaching that a human body, an adult human body, could survive cold to a certain degree, but a newborn could not maintain its own temperature at all. The babies needed the heat from outside themselves, or they would simply stop. It was not complicated biology, it was just terrible. She went over the cabin with a different eye, the eye of someone who had burned everything obvious and was now looking at the non-obvious. The floor planks were nailed down and she had no pry bar. The walls were log construction, mortared at the gaps with mud and straw, and she could potentially break up one of the interior partitions, but the interior partitions were what kept the wind out of the sleeping area, and without them, the cold would come faster than the wood would burn. The loft ladder. She hadn't thought of the loft ladder. It was a simple thing, 8 rungs of roughly cut pine nailed between 2 uprights, and she pulled it down from the loft opening and laid it on the floor and looked at it. Dry pine, old and seasoned. Maybe an hour's worth of heat, maybe more. She went and got the hatchet. She was not good with the hatchet. Her father had been teaching her, but she was 11, and her arms weren't built for it, and the first swing missed the rung entirely and buried itself in the floor planks. The second connected but didn't split clean. She worked at it with a stubbornness that had nothing to do with skill and everything to do with the fact that stopping wasn't an option, and eventually she had a pile of rough split ladder wood that she judged would burn. She fed 2 pieces to the fire. She stacked the rest within arm's reach. Then she sat back down on the floor, pulled the quilt around her shoulders, and looked at the door. "He's not coming," said the part of her mind that had been saying this for 2 days now, quiet and certain, the way that voice always was. He would have come by now if he was coming. She didn't argue with it. She'd tried arguing with it. The voice was patient. It had more material than she did. "So what do you do?" she asked it. The voice didn't answer that part. The voice was much better at identifying problems than solving them. She pulled the quilt tighter. Outside, the wind dropped for a moment. Not stopped, just paused, like it was taking a breath. And in that brief pocket of quiet, she heard something. She was on her feet before she'd decided to move. It was faint. It might have been nothing. The wind did things out here that fooled you. It moved through the trees in patterns that sounded like voices, like hoofbeats, like someone calling from a distance. Her father had warned her about this the first winter they'd spent in the mountains, when she'd been 8 and had run outside twice in one night, convinced someone was shouting for help. But she stood by the door with her hand flat on the wood, and she listened. There it was again, not a voice, not hoofbeats, something else, something rhythmic, a creak, a regular creak, the sound of weight moving through snow. Clara's hand found the latch. She didn't open the door all the way. She opened it 4 inches, just enough to see, and the cold hit her face like a slap, and she squinted into the dying afternoon light. The snow had crusted on top from the wind, and someone was breaking through it. She could see them, a shape moving toward the cabin from the direction of the trees, roughly man-shaped, moving slowly, and leading what appeared to be a horse, a big horse. The shape of the load on the horse told her this was a freight animal, not a saddle horse, not her father's horse, not her father. She shut the door and put her back against it and tried to think clearly. A stranger. A man. Alone. Coming to the cabin from the freight road, which meant he was a driver of some kind, which meant he had no reason to be at this cabin specifically. He had stopped because of something else, and she didn't know what, and she didn't know who he was. Her father had talked to her about strangers on the frontier. He'd been specific about it because her father believed in being specific. "Not everyone who comes to your door in bad weather is coming for shelter," he'd said. "Some are. Probably most are. But some are not." The fire. The smoke from the chimney. It had been visible. She knew it would be visible against the white sky. Someone traveling the freight road would see it, would think the cabin was occupied and safe, which it was, and would approach because shelter in a storm was shelter, and that was reasonable. That was what any sensible traveler would do. The twins were in the drawer by the fire. Clara picked up her father's rifle from the wall rack. She'd fired it 4 times in her life, twice at targets and twice at a coyote that had gotten into the henhouse 2 summers ago. She hadn't hit the coyote. She had a reasonable understanding of how the weapon worked. She checked that it was loaded. It was. and she positioned herself near the window where she could see the door and still see the twins behind her. The knock came 3 minutes later, solid, measured. 2 knocks, a pause, 2 more. "Hello in the cabin," a man's voice said. Deep, a little rough, the voice of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. "I'm a freight driver, name's Elias Mercer, out of Bitterroot. I saw smoke. Not asking for much, just to get out of the wind for an hour and rest my horse." Clara said nothing. "I got my own food," the voice continued. "Own blankets. I'm not here to cause trouble. If you're not comfortable letting me in, that's fine. I can shelter in your lean-to with your animal, if you got one." He'd said your animal. He'd noticed the lean-to, or heard Bessie, or both. "I can hear you in there," the voice said. "You're moving around. Just want you to know I'm not trying to surprise nobody." Clara looked at the twins. She looked at the 6 pieces of wood she had left. She looked at the fire, which was burning steady but not high, and she thought about how many hours they had left. "Are you alone?" she called through the door. There was a short pause, maybe surprise at the voice. "Yes, ma'am. Just me and my horse." "Ma'am." She was 11 years old. She stood there with a rifle and her dead mother's quilt around her shoulders, and she almost laughed, except that laughing seemed very far away right now. "How old are you?" she called. Another pause, longer. 43, he said. "I know that doesn't tell you much. I don't know what would." "Do you have a family?" "Had one," he said. "Don't anymore." She didn't know why that answered something for her, but it did. She opened the door with the rifle pointed at the floor. Not at him, because she wasn't going to threaten a man who might not need threatening, but near enough that the message was clear. She got her first look at Elias Mercer in the pale light of the doorway, and here's what she saw. A large man, probably 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, wearing a heavy canvas coat that had been patched in 3 places, and a hat so beaten by weather it had lost whatever original shape it had started with. His face was the face of a man who spent his life outside, creased and weathered and wind-reddened, and his beard was going gray at the edges, and there was something in his eyes, some quality she couldn't name immediately, that was neither threatening nor warm, but was simply tired. A tiredness that went past cold and hunger into something older. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her. He didn't change his expression. "You're a child," he said. "I know what I am," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where are your people?" "My father is coming back," she said. "He went for help before the storm." Mercer looked at the sky, which was the color of an old bruise. He looked at the chimney, which was putting out thin smoke. Then he looked back at her. "How long has he been gone?" he asked. She didn't answer. He seemed to take the silence as an answer anyway, because something shifted in his face. Not pity, exactly, which she would have hated, but a recalibration, like a man who'd done a sum in his head and gotten a result he hadn't expected. "Who else is in there?" he asked. "Nobody," she said. And then, from behind her, Henry chose that moment to contribute to the conversation with a sound that was clearly and unmistakably infant. Mercer's eyebrows moved. He didn't say anything. He waited. Clara lowered the rifle to her side. "Babies," she said. "2 of them. They were born 4 days ago." She swallowed. "My mother didn't—" She stopped. Started again. "I'm the one taking care of them." He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment, and she stood inside with the rifle at her side and looked back at him, and the cold poured in between them like a third person in the conversation. And then Elias Mercer took off his hat and held it in both hands. "Miss," he said carefully, "I'm not going to hurt you or those babies. I'm going to tell you that plainly, and I'm not going to expect you to believe it because you don't know me. But I would like to come in, if you'll let me, and I would like to see what you've got left to work with. And I would like to help if there's any help to be given." He paused. "And I'll stand back out here in the cold until you decide, and I won't be angry with you either way." Clara thought about it for about 4 seconds. "Come in," she said, "but the rifle stays in my hands." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Mercer said. I was inside for about 30 seconds before he started taking stock of things, and she could see it happening, the way his eyes moved over the room, calculating, the same way her father did when he was solving a problem. He looked at the fire. He looked at the small pile of split ladder wood. He looked at the drawer where the babies lay. He looked at the empty wood box and the hatchet on the floor and the bare place where the bookshelf had been. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he crouched by the drawer and looked at the twins, not touching them, just looking. "Boy and girl?" he said. "Yes." He studied the girl for a long moment. "She eating?" "Not much," Claire said. "The cow's gone bad. I've been giving them salt pork broth on a cloth." He was quiet again. She could see him thinking. "The girl's cold," he said. Not an accusation, just a statement of what he was seeing. "I know. I've been trying to keep the fire up, but I'm almost out of—" "I got a cord of wood on that freight wagon," Mercer said. He stood up and looked at her. "Customer order, out of Bitterroot. Cedar and pine, cut last summer." He paused. "I think the customer will understand the circumstances." Clara looked at him. Something in her chest, something she hadn't let herself feel in days, because feeling it would have meant hoping for something that might not come, cracked open about a quarter inch. She didn't cry. She wasn't going to cry. But her voice when she spoke was not entirely steady. "How much is a cord of wood?" she asked. "Enough," Mercer said simply. "More than enough." He put his hat back on and moved toward the door. "I'm going to bring in a load. I'll knock before I come back in." "You don't have to knock," Clara said. "You can just come in." He looked at her over his shoulder. "I'll knock anyway," he said. He went out into the cold, and Clara stood by the drawer with her hand on Henry's blanket, and she realized that her hand was shaking, and she realized that she hadn't noticed until now because she'd been shaking so long that it had started to feel like her natural state. She looked down at the little girl in the drawer, the one with no name yet, the one with the weak grip and the too pale skin, and she said something she hadn't said out loud to anyone yet. "Someone came," she said. "Someone actually came." Henry, for once, was quiet. The little girl did not open her eyes, but her chest rose and fell, and in the firelight that was strengthening now, building towards something with the cedar and pine that was coming through the door, that rise and fall was the most important thing in the world. Outside, Elias Mercer knocked twice before he came back in. He'd said he would, and he did, and in a week that had given Clara almost nothing she'd been promised, that small kept promise, 2 knocks, a pause, the door opening, was the thing that finally made her believe that maybe surviving this was not just a thing she had to do alone. It didn't make things safe. It didn't make things easy. The girl in the drawer was still fading, and the storm outside was still deciding what it wanted to be, and somewhere in the mountains her father was somewhere that he wasn't coming back from, though she didn't know that yet. But the fire was building, and there was wood on the wagon, and a man with tired eyes and a patched coat was stacking it by the door and asking no questions that she didn't want to answer. And Clara Whitlock, 11 years old, 63 pounds of bone and stubbornness, the oldest person in a cabin that needed someone to be, sat down on the floor between the babies and the fire and kept watch, because that was what she did. That was what she was. And for the first time in 6 days, she thought there was a chance, not a guarantee, not a promise, just a chance, that tomorrow would come for all 3 of them. Elias Mercer made 4 trips to the wagon before he said another word that wasn't strictly practical. The first trip brought in an armload of cedar that he stacked beside the fire with the efficiency of a man who had done this particular task 10,000 times and didn't need to think about it. The second trip brought pine, split thin, the kind that caught fast and burned hot, good for bringing up a cold room quickly, though it didn't last as long as the cedar. The third trip brought something else, a canvas sack that he set near the door without explanation, and a heavy wool blanket that he draped over the back of the one remaining chair, the one Clara hadn't burned because it was wedged in a corner and she hadn't gotten to it yet. The fourth trip he came back with his own bedroll under one arm and a tin box under the other, and he set both of these against the wall farthest from the twins and sat down on the floor with his back against the logs and looked at Clara, who had not moved from her position on the floor beside the bureau drawer the entire time he'd been going in and out. "You eat today?" he asked. "Some," she said, which was not entirely a lie. She'd had a small piece of hardtack that morning and half a cup of the salt pork broth, which tasted like regret and warm water. He opened the tin box. Inside, she could see, even from across the room, dried beef, biscuits that looked like they'd survived considerable hardship, and 2 apples that had shriveled to about half their original size but were still, unmistakably, apples. He held one out toward her without getting up, which she appreciated because it meant he wasn't trying to close the distance without her permission. She got up and took it and sat back down. She ate about half of it before she realized she was eating it too fast and made herself slow down. Mercer watched the fire and said nothing about this. He cut a piece of the dried beef with a small knife from his belt, chewed it slowly, and appeared to be doing calculations in his head. "The girl," he said. "She taken any food in the last few hours?" Clara looked at the little one. She took some broth on the cloth about... She tried to remember. Time had become strange and elastic since Tuesday. "Maybe 3 hours ago. A little, not much." "She keep it down?" "I think so. She spit up some." Clara paused. "She always spits up some." Mercer nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The milk from your cow, when did you first notice it was off?" "Yesterday morning. The back quarter was swollen." "You dumped the milk?" "Yes." He nodded again, like she'd answered a test question correctly. "Good. Mastitis milk can kill a healthy calf. It would have..." He stopped himself. "You did right," he said instead. She appreciated that he'd stopped himself. She didn't need him to finish that sentence. "The broth won't be enough," he said. "Not for either of them, but especially not for her. A newborn needs..." He paused again in the careful way of a man who knew more than he was sure he should say to an 11-year-old. "They need more than broth. Their bodies can't hold heat on their own, and they burn through what little they take in fast." "I know," Clara said. "I've been trying to figure out what to do." He looked at her for a moment. "What have you come up with?" It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. Not the kind that adults asked to make a point. He actually wanted to know what she'd thought of. She studied him for a second, trying to figure out if there was a trick in it, and found nothing except the tired eyes and the waiting. "I thought about trying to find another nursing mother," she said. "There's a farm about 4 miles east, the Henley place. Mrs. Henley had a baby in September, but I don't know if she's still... She stopped because she couldn't walk 4 miles in this snow and leave the twins, and she couldn't carry both twins 4 miles in this snow, and she couldn't leave one and take one, and all 3 directions led to the same wall." "What else?" Mercer said. "Goat's milk, if it was watered down and warmed right, but we don't have a goat. I thought about..." She hesitated. "I thought about trying to get to Bitterroot." He was quiet. "It's a stupid idea," she said. "I know it's a stupid idea. It's 15 miles and I don't know what we'd do when we got there, or who would..." "It's not a stupid idea," Mercer said. "The destination's right. The problem is the 15 miles in a blizzard with 2 newborns and 1 11-year-old. He said it plainly, without making it feel like an insult. "But the destination is right. Bitterroot has got a doctor, and it's got women who've nursed babies, and it's got shelter." He looked at the fire. "I came from that direction. Road is bad, but I made it." He was quiet for a moment. "My freight wagon has a full canvas cover. It's not a good ride in cold weather, but it's a covered ride." Clara looked at him. "I'm not saying right now," he said quickly. "Tonight the temperature's going to drop more. We'd kill those babies moving them tonight." He paused. "But tomorrow, if the wind drops, and I think it will, I've been watching the sky. We could talk about it." Clara looked at the little girl in the drawer, at the gray-ash skin and the too still chest, at the way the firelight that was now blazing warm and steady, thanks to his cedar, was not putting any color into those cheeks that wasn't coming from somewhere external. "She might not make it to tomorrow," Clara said. The words came out flat, and she hadn't meant them to be flat. She'd meant to say them like a practical statement of fact, which is what they were, but they hit the air of the cabin and sat there, and Mercer didn't rush to cover them with reassurance, which she was grateful for, because false reassurance was something she had run completely out of patience for somewhere around day 2. "She might not," he agreed. "So let's think about what we do tonight, and then we'll think about tomorrow when tomorrow gets here." He didn't try to take over. That was the thing she kept noticing, the thing that recalibrated her read of him every hour or so. He didn't come into the cabin with the manner that most adult men came into rooms. That assumption of authority, the way they rearranged the furniture of a situation to put themselves at the center of it. Mercer moved around the edges. He fed the fire when she wasn't near it. He heated water in the small pot she pointed him toward. He asked before he touched anything that wasn't his. Around what she guessed was 7 in the evening, she'd lost track of the clock, which had stopped 2 days ago and which she hadn't wound because winding it felt like an acknowledgement that time was continuing, which she'd had complicated feelings about. He opened the canvas sack he'd brought in on the second trip and produced something unexpected. It was a tin of condensed milk. Sweetened, the label said. She'd seen it in stores, but her mother had considered it a luxury, and they'd never had it in the house. "It's not perfect," Mercer said, setting it on the floor near the fire to warm the tin slightly before opening. "It's sweet, which isn't ideal for a newborn, but it's milk and it's calories, and if you thin it down with boiled water, it's better than broth." He looked at her. "Your call. It's not what a doctor would order. I want to be honest about that." "Do you have more than one?" Clara asked. He thought. 2 more in the wagon." "Open this one," she said. She watched him work the tin open with a small tool from his coat pocket, watched him measure what looked like a reasonable amount into the small pan with boiled water, watched him stir it carefully over the low edge of the fire until it was warm. Not hot. She checked it on her own wrist the way her mother had taught her to check anything going to a baby. And then she soaked the cloth and carried it to the drawer. Henry took it immediately, and with enthusiasm that was almost offensive given the circumstances. The girl took less. She always took less. But she took it, and Clara watched the tiny throat work, swallowing, and felt something loosen in her chest by about 1/10 of a degree. "Good girl," she said quietly. "Come on, keep going." The baby took 4 pulls from the cloth and then stopped and turned her face away in that particular manner that suggested she was done, which was not nearly enough, but it was more than the broth had gotten, and Clara re-soaked the cloth and tried again and got 3 more before the little one's eyes closed. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at Mercer. "Better than nothing," she said. "Better than nothing," he agreed. Somewhere around 9 o'clock, Henry fell into a real sleep, the deep, pulling kind, not the shallow, restless doze he'd been managing, and the little girl slept too, and for the first time in 4 days both babies were sleeping at the same time, and the fire was actually genuinely warm, and Elias Mercer sat against the far wall eating a biscuit and looking at the fire, and Clara sat beside the drawer and felt the strange, disorienting weight of a moment where nothing required her immediate action. She didn't know what to do with it. "What did you lose?" she asked. She hadn't planned to ask. It came out of somewhere she hadn't been examining. He looked at her. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. "Wife," he said. 7 years ago. Fever." He ate a bite of the biscuit, chewed, swallowed. "Son." He was 4. Same fever, 2 days after. Clara looked at the twins. "I'm sorry," she said. "Yeah," he said. It wasn't dismissive. It was just the sound of someone who had said thank you to that particular condolence enough times that the formality had worn away, and what was left was just the plain truth of the thing. "Is that why you drive freight?" she asked. After. He thought about it for a moment, the genuine thinking, not the polite pause before a prepared answer. "Partly," he said. "Movement helped, for a while. Still helps, some." He looked at the fire. "And I'm not good at being in one place anymore. A house..." He stopped. "A house has too many corners where things used to be." Clara understood this in a way she hadn't expected to understand it. She looked at her mother's chair, the one she hadn't burned, the one with the slight indentation in the seat cushion from years of the same person sitting in the same place. "I burned most of our furniture," she said, "for heat. I know, I saw. I burned my father's books." Mercer glanced at the empty place where the bookshelf had been. "He know you did that," he said. "He'd say you made the right choice." "You don't know him." "No," Mercer said. "But I know what books are, and I know what babies are, and there's a clear order to those things." Clara almost smiled. Not quite. But the muscles around her mouth did something unfamiliar for a moment. "He went to get help before the storm came," she said. "He was supposed to be back in 4 days. It's been 6. Mercer was quiet. "You came from Bitterroot," she said. "Did you—" She stopped. Because asking the question meant accepting the reality of the answer, and she hadn't quite decided if she was ready for that. "I came through from Harlan's Creek," Mercer said, "about 2 miles east of Bitterroot. I didn't come through Bitterroot town itself. I cut around on the freight road." He paused. "I didn't see anyone on the road coming this direction, but the road's been bad. A man could have taken shelter anywhere along that route, And I wouldn't necessarily have seen him. He said it carefully. He said it like he meant it to be comforting, and maybe some of it was. And maybe some of it was just a careful man not saying a thing he couldn't take back. Clara nodded. She didn't push it further. "What's your horse's name?" she asked instead. He blinked. "Gideon." "Is Gideon warm enough in the lean-to?" "He's been in worse," Mercer said. "He's a draft horse, built for cold. He'll be fine." "Bessie's in there too," Clara said. "She's not going to bother him. She's gentle." "I introduce myself," Mercer said, with a kind of deadpan that took her completely off guard, and this time she did actually produce something that was, if not a laugh, at least a first cousin to one. A short, exhaled sound that surprised her on the way out. Mercer didn't make a big deal of it. He just ate the rest of his biscuit. Oh. She woke up at 3 a.m. to Henry screaming. Not the complaining cry, not the hungry cry, but something different. A high, urgent sound that had a different quality to it. A panic-adjacent sound that she'd never heard from him before. And she was across the room before she was fully awake, her hand in the drawer, checking. Henry was fine. Henry was howling because he was hungry, and had apparently decided that polite fussing was no longer getting results fast enough. But the little girl... Clara's hand found her and felt it immediately. The chill. A cold that was different from the cold of the room, a cold that was coming from inside, from the small body not producing enough heat to hold off the temperature of the air around her. The fire had dropped while Clara slept, not out, but lower than it should have been. And the little one had no reserves, nothing to draw on, nothing to fight with. "Hey!" Clara's voice came out louder than she meant. "Hey, wake up!" Mercer was awake before she'd finished the second word. He was across the room in 5 seconds, one look at the drawer telling him what he needed to know. And he did something that Clara had not anticipated. He reached in without asking and lifted the little girl out of the drawer and held her against his chest. Against his skin, she realized, because he'd opened his coat and pressed the baby directly to the warmth of his own body. "Stoke the fire," he said. Not loud, not panicked, just clear. Clara stoked the fire. She threw on 2 pieces of cedar without thinking about rationing, because some calculations were simpler than others. "She's not," Clara started. "She's breathing," Mercer said. "I can feel it." He kept the baby pressed against him, his big coat wrapped around her, his hand curved over her back. "Get that cloth. Put it in the condensed milk mixture. It'll still be warm near the fire, and bring it here." Clara did it fast, and for the next 10 minutes they worked. She soaking and re-soaking the cloth, Mercer holding the baby against his warmth and angling her head so Clara could press the cloth to her mouth, both of them focused, neither of them speaking except in the short necessary sentences of people doing urgent practical work together. The baby took some. Not a lot, but some. Her color came back slowly, not to rosy health, nothing so dramatic, but the blue-gray tinge at her lips pulled back by degrees. And after 20 minutes, Mercer said quietly, "She's warming." And Clara believed him because she could feel it too when she pressed her own palm to the little head. Henry had eventually cried himself into exhausted silence and then back to sleep, the self-centered pragmatism of the very young asserting itself. Clara sat on the floor with her back against the bureau and her knees pulled up and looked at Mercer, who was still holding the little girl against his chest, wrapped in his coat, sitting against the opposite wall. The fire was high, and the room was warm, and outside the wind had in fact dropped considerably in the last few hours. She could hear the difference without even going to the window. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her over the top of the baby's wrapped head. "You had it," he said. "I just helped." "I didn't have it," she said. "I was asleep." "You've been awake for 2 days," he said. "You had to sleep sometime." She shook her head. "Not until they're safe." "They're not going to be safe until we get them to Bitterroot," Mercer said. He said it gently, but he said it plainly. "You know that. The condensed milk will run out. The cow can't be milked. This fire is good, but if you'd slept another hour—" He didn't finish that. Clara looked at the window. The quality of the dark had changed. It was the kind of dark that meant 3 or 4 in the morning, the deepest part of winter night. "If the wind holds off," she said, "it's holding off now. It could come back." "It could," he agreed. "But tomorrow morning, if it stays like this, I think we have a window, a real one." He looked down at the baby. She needs more than I can give her here. She needs a woman who can nurse her. That's the plain truth. I can keep her warm. I can't feed her what her body needs." He paused. "You can make this decision. It's yours to make. I'll do whatever you decide." Clara looked at him for a long moment. This large man with the gray-edged beard and the patched coat, sitting on the floor of her family's cabin in the middle of the Montana night with a nameless infant pressed against his chest, telling an 11-year-old that the decision was hers to make. She believed him. She didn't know exactly when she had started believing him, but she had. Sometime between the first load of firewood and the way he'd said she's breathing without any performance of calm, just the fact of it, clean and direct. "Dawn," she said. "If the wind's still down at dawn, we go." He nodded. "I'll get the wagon ready before light." "Wake me," she said. "Don't let me sleep through it." "I'll wake you," he said. She lay down on the floor beside the bureau with her coat pulled over her, and she was asleep inside of 3 minutes. And Elias Mercer sat against the far wall with the nameless little girl against his chest and kept watch, the way she had kept watch for 6 days, because someone had to, and it was his turn. He woke her at 5:30 with a hand on her shoulder and the words, "winds down," spoken quietly before she was fully conscious, and she was on her feet and checking the twins before he finished the sentence, both breathing. Henry awake and already beginning his morning editorial on the state of things. The little girl, still pale, still worryingly light, awake too, her dark eyes open, tracking toward the light from the fire in the way that newborns tracked light, which Clara had learned in the past 4 days was one of the better signs. The one that meant something was still working in the direction of staying. Clara fed them both as much as they'd take from the cloth, while Mercer went out to prepare the wagon. She could hear him moving in the lean-to, the sounds of harness, of Gideon being hitched, of the wagon being positioned. She heard him speak to Bessie too, something too low to make out, which she found she was glad of, because Bessie had been neglected in the crisis and Clara had been carrying guilt about it. She gathered what she could carry. 2 extra blankets from the chest, the ones she hadn't burned and hadn't burned on purpose, because they were the ones that smelled like her mother and she hadn't been ready to let that go. The condensed milk, the remaining 2 tins, the hardtack from the canvas bag that Mercer had told her to take, the rifle, because her father would expect it. She looked around the cabin. The chair with the worn cushion, the empty bookshelf, the bare hook on the wall where her mother's apron had hung before Clara had cut it into feeding cloths. The bed, still unmade because she hadn't made herself go near it since Tuesday. She wasn't going to let herself fall apart in this doorway. She had 2 living things depending on her and a window of weather that could close by afternoon and a man outside who had sat up all night holding a baby that wasn't his. She picked up Henry, settled him against her chest, picked up the little girl, and settled her into the crook of her other arm, and walked out of the cabin. The cold hit her like a wall, sharp and clean after days of smoky, close air, and the light was the particular steel blue of pre-dawn in January. Everything hushed, the snow stretching out flat and white, and almost beautiful when it wasn't actively trying to kill you. The wind was, in fact, down. Not nothing. There was a light movement to the air, but the howling, driving fury of the past week had pulled back to something that felt almost reasonable. Mercer had arranged the wagon bed with care. He'd laid his own bedroll flat as a base, covered it with 2 of the freight blankets, heavy wool, the kind shipped to trading posts, and created what amounted to a padded nest in the center of the covered wagon. A second arrangement showed her where she was meant to sit, braced against the side, with room to hold both babies against her body. He stood by the wagon and looked at her. "You'll need to keep them as close to your body as you can manage," he said. "I'll push Gideon as fast as I safely can. If either baby shows signs of—" He stopped. "You'll tell me if anything changes." "I'll tell you," she said. "If the wind comes back up, we'll stop. I've got enough wood to make a fire fast if we need to shelter on the road." "Okay." Bitterroot is 15 miles. With road conditions, I'd say 4 hours, maybe 5. Clara looked at the little girl in her arm. She thought about what 5 hours meant for a baby who'd already had 2 close calls in 12 hours. She didn't say this out loud. "Let's go," she said. He helped her into the wagon, steadied her without making it feel like help, just a hand placed at the right moment, and she settled into the nest he'd made and pulled the twins in close, the heavy blankets pulled up over all 3 of them until only her face was exposed, and she arranged herself with the careful deliberateness of someone assembling something important. Henry immediately expressed his feelings about wagon travel at volume. The little girl was quiet. Clara pressed her closer. The wagon started to move, Gideon's big hooves punching through the crusted snow with a sound like slow applause, and the cabin fell behind them, and Clara did not look back. She'd made herself a rule about that, not because looking back would undo anything, but because she needed every piece of her attention on what was ahead. The road to Bitterroot was, as Mercer had warned, bad. It wasn't impassable. His freight wagon was built for rough terrain, and Gideon was precisely the kind of horse that looked at difficult conditions and did not revise his opinion of himself. But the drifts across the road in several places were deep enough that the going was slow and lurching, and Clara braced herself against the wagon's side and kept the twins locked against her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would make it go faster. About an hour in, the little girl stopped making any sound at all. Not distress silence, not screaming, just nothing. Clara looked down and found the baby's eyes closed, which could have been sleep, should have been sleep, except that the quality of the stillness felt different, and Clara pressed her palm to the small chest and felt breathing, shallow, but breathing. "She's still with us," Clara said, more to herself than to Mercer, but he must have heard because the wagon slowed for a moment. She could tell by the change in rhythm, and then picked up again. "How far?" Clara called. 10 miles, Mercer said. "Maybe a bit less?" 10 miles. In this cold. With the little girl's breathing as shallow as it was. Clara pulled the baby closer, tucked the blanket tighter, breathed deliberately against the top of the small head, her own breath, her own warmth, whatever she had, and thought, "You are not leaving. I have not come this far and spent this many cold nights on this floor for you to leave now. I don't care how tired you are. Neither am I, but here we are." It was not a rational thought. It was not even a real conversation. But she said it inside her head with the particular force of someone who had run out of more elegant options. The wagon kept moving. Henry had exhausted himself and gone to sleep somewhere around mile 3, and Clara was grateful for this. One less demand on her attention, one less source of movement that might disturb the careful arrangement of blankets. The cold was a constant presence, but it was not the killing cold of the cabin's worst nights. The covered wagon held enough shared body heat to keep the temperature inside it tolerable, and Mercer had clearly thought about the arrangement. At about the 2.5-hour mark, something changed in the sky. She could see it through a gap in the canvas where the cover was lashed to the wagon's front board. The steel blue had shifted to something lighter, almost white, and the quality of the light had that particular flat brightness that came before snow. Not the storm returning, not that heavy darkness, but light snow. The kind that could thicken or not depending on what the day decided. "Is it going to snow?" she called. "Some," Mercer said. "Light. I've seen worse today already." He paused. 5 miles. She looked down at the little girl. The shallow breathing continued. 5 miles. Clara had stopped being cold sometime around hour 2. She didn't know if that was because the shared warmth of the blankets had actually worked, or because she'd gone past cold into some state on the other side of it, where the sensation no longer registered as a specific complaint. She was aware that this might not be a good sign for herself, but she filed that concern in the category of things she could address later. "I named her," Clara said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out because the silence had gotten heavy and she needed something to put in it. "What did you call her?" Mercer said. Clara looked at the baby. She'd been thinking about it in the wagon, turning names over with the automatic part of her mind while the functional part kept watch. Not her grandmother's name. Not any name from the past that would arrive with the weight of someone else's life already attached to it. "May," she said. "Clara May is my full name. Just May for her." She didn't have a neat explanation for it. Something about keeping a version of herself close to this baby who was going to need to be stubborn. Something about naming a thing you intended to keep. "May Whitlock," Mercer said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a good name." "I know," Clara said. The wagon moved through the beginning of the light snowfall, through the frozen pine corridors of the road, through the last 5 miles of whatever this was. Not a journey, not an adventure, not a story she would ever fully want to tell. And Clara held Henry in one arm and May in the other and watched the baby's chest and counted breaths and kept track of whether the count was holding. It was holding. It was barely holding, but it was holding. And when the first shapes of Bitterroot's buildings appeared through the canvas gap, smoke from chimneys, the dark lines of roof lines against the white sky, Clara felt something move through her that was not relief, not yet, because relief required safety, and they weren't there yet, but it was the shape of where relief was going to be, if things went right, the outline of it, the promise of its possibility. "I see it," she said. "Quarter mile," Mercer said. "There's a woman, Margaret Hale. She nursed her youngest through the fall, and I know her to be a decent person. I'll take you there first." "Before the doctor?" He hesitated. "What May needs right now isn't medicine, it's milk, and a woman who can give it to her." He paused. "I'll get the doctor after." Clara looked at May's pale face, at the barely there movement of her chest. "Then go to Margaret Hale," Clara said. The wagon came into Bitterroot with Gideon's hooves loud on the frozen Main Street, and the few people who were out in the early morning cold stopped and looked. And Mercer didn't slow for any of them, just called directions to himself under his breath as he navigated. And 3 minutes later, the wagon stopped in front of a small house with yellow curtains in the window. I was off the wagon seat and at the door before Clara had finished untangling herself from the blankets, and he knocked, hard, purposeful, the knock of a man with no time for hesitation. And Clara stood in the wagon holding May with both hands and felt the baby's breath on her wrist, still there, still counting. The door opened. A woman in her 30s, red-haired with a child on her hip and the look of someone pulled from breakfast, looked at Mercer and then looked at the wagon and looked at Clara, and her expression went through several things quickly. "Elias," she said, "what in the—" "Margaret," Mercer said, "I've got a newborn who hasn't eaten properly in 4 days. I need you." Margaret Hale looked at the wagon again, at Clara holding the wrapped bundle, and something shifted in her face, the surprise falling away into something practical and immediate. "Bring her in," she said. And that was how May Whitlock arrived in Bitterroot on a January morning, carried through a yellow curtained door by an 11-year-old who had been holding her since the day she was born, into the hands of a woman who didn't ask questions before she acted, which was exactly the kind of person they needed. Clara sat in Margaret Hale's kitchen and held Henry and watched the woman try to nurse May, and the baby turned her face away, and Clara's heart dropped, and Margaret tried again with the patience of someone who had done this before, and understood that a baby who had gone hungry long enough sometimes forgot what to do about food. And the whole room was very quiet, and Clara held Henry so tight he started to complain. And on the third try, May Whitlock took the first real food of her life. The sound she made was small, the smallest sound. But in that kitchen, in that morning, it was the loudest thing Clara had ever heard. May fed for 4 minutes, that was all. 4 minutes, and then she stopped and her head fell back against Margaret Hale's arm, with a limpness that made Clara's stomach drop straight through the floor. But Margaret put her hand on the baby's chest immediately and said, "She's breathing," in a voice that was calm in the practiced way of a woman who had kept her head through bad things before. And Clara believed her because she had no choice but to believe her. "She's exhausted," Margaret said. She stood up with the baby still against her and carried her to the small bed near the kitchen fire, the one where her own infant slept, and laid May down beside it and covered her with a blanket that smelled like milk and wood smoke. Her body took everything it had just to eat that little bit. She's going to sleep now. She looked at Clara. "That's what we want. Sleep means she's using what she got." "Is that enough?" Clara said. 4 minutes? Margaret looked at her steadily. "It's more than nothing, and more than nothing is what we're working with." She came back to the table and sat across from Clara, who was still holding Henry with the grip of someone who'd been holding on to things for so long her hands had forgotten how to open. "When did you last sleep? Real sleep, not the kind you get sitting up." "I slept some in the wagon," Clara said. "That's not what I asked." Clara couldn't actually answer the question with a specific number, which she understood was itself an answer. Margaret looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman cataloging a situation, taking inventory, like Mercer had done in the cabin, though Margaret's version of it was warmer around the edges. "You're going to eat something," Margaret said, "and then you're going to tell me everything from the beginning, and I'm going to figure out what comes next, yes?" "Where's Mercer?" Clara said. "He went for Doc Briggs." Margaret was already at the stove, moving with the competent efficiency of a woman who cooked for a family and didn't waste motions. "He'll be back. He's not the kind of man who leaves things unfinished." Clara had known Mercer for less than 12 hours. She thought Margaret was right anyway. Well, Doc Briggs arrived 40 minutes later, which was faster than Clara had expected, which suggested either that Mercer had been persuasive or that Dr. Briggs was a man who moved quickly when moved. He was older than she'd anticipated, somewhere in his 60s, with white hair and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades examining things in poor light. And he examined May first, then Henry, with hands that were steady and sure and gave nothing away. He was quiet for a long time after. "The boy is hungry, but he's solid," he said finally. "Good lungs, good color, grip strong, underfed but compensating." He looked at May. "The girl is another matter." Clara made herself hold still. "She's got some congestion in her chest that worries me. Cold, exposure, and inadequate nutrition for the first 4 days. Her body's been fighting on too many fronts at once." He paused. "She needs warmth, she needs milk, regular feeding, as often as she'll take it, and she needs—" He stopped and looked at Clara directly, in the way that doctors looked at people when they were deciding how plain to be. "She needs the next 24 hours to go well. That's what I can tell you. After 24 hours, if she's still taking food and her temperature holds, I'll feel better about things." "And if it doesn't go well," Clara said. Briggs was quiet for a moment. "Let's focus on the next 24 hours, he said. Clara nodded. She'd heard the answer in the pause. Mercer was leaning against the wall near the door, arms folded, watching. He caught her eye when she looked up, and he didn't offer her a consoling expression or a reassuring nod. He just looked at her, level and present, which was what she needed more than consolation. "What do I do?" Clara asked the doctor. "Right now," Briggs said. "Nothing. Margaret is the most capable nursing mother in this town, and she's going to do what needs doing with that baby. What you need to do is sleep." He looked at her more carefully. "How old are you?" 11, Clara said. Something moved across his face. Not pity, but something adjacent to it. The particular expression of a man who had seen things in his profession that he'd never made peace with. 11 years old, he said quietly, more to himself than her. Lord. Clara waited for him to say something useless after that. Something about how remarkable she was. Something that would make her feel like a spectacle. And she was already preparing to not respond to it, but he just closed his bag and stood up. "Eat," he said to her. "Sleep. I'll be back this evening." He left, and the room felt slightly larger without him in it, and Clara looked at the place where May was sleeping and thought, 24 hours. That was the number. That was what they were working toward. She did not sleep right away. She meant to. She'd told herself she would, the moment someone else was watching the babies, the moment she could put that weight down even temporarily. But when Margaret settled Henry in the basket beside her own baby and came back and told Clara the bed in the back room was hers for as long as she needed it, Clara sat on the edge of that bed and couldn't make herself horizontal. Part of it was the strangeness of a house that wasn't hers, smelling of other people's cooking and other people's soap. Part of it was the 11-year-old certainty that if she stopped watching, something would happen the moment she stopped. But most of it, she understood if she was honest with herself, was the fact that here, in this warm and ordinary kitchen, with someone else holding the emergency, there was suddenly space for everything she'd been keeping out for 6 days. It was pressing against the door she'd held shut, her mother's face in the last hour, her father's hand on her shoulder saying, "You're the most capable girl I've ever known." The sound Ruth Whitlock had made that Tuesday evening that Clara could not name and would not name, and she didn't know if she could let it in and still function, and functioning was the only thing she knew how to do right now. She lay down with her coat still on. She was asleep before she'd decided to be. She woke to voices. Low, in the kitchen, more than 2 people talking. She could hear Margaret's voice and Mercer's, and a third voice she didn't know yet. A man's voice, serious and deliberate. She lay still for a moment and took stock of herself the way her father had taught her. Before you move, know where you are and what's around you, and identified that she was in a warm room in a real bed, and there were no babies crying, which meant the babies were being managed, which meant something had gone either well or terribly wrong while she slept. She was up and in the kitchen in 30 seconds. May was still in the small bed by the fire, still sleeping. Clara checked the chest, still rising and falling, and let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding, and then looked at the people in the room. Margaret was at the table. Mercer was near the door, still with his coat on, though he'd taken the hat off. The third voice belonged to a man she didn't know, maybe 50, with the look of someone who worked outdoors but not physically. The complexion of a man who spent time in weather but didn't do labor in it. He had a notebook open on the table. "She's awake," Margaret said, looking at Clara. All three of them looked at her. The unknown man's eyes were sharp and assessing in a way that made her straighten her spine automatically. "Clara," Mercer said, "this is Frank Alderman. He's the county sheriff." Clara looked at Alderman. Alderman looked back at her with the steady patience of a man who spent his professional life waiting for people to be ready. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "I'm glad you're on your feet. I'd like to talk with you about your father when you're ready." Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "What about him?" she said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was more like an acknowledgement that a conversation she hadn't been ready for was starting regardless. Alderman glanced at Mercer, then back at her. "Why don't you sit down?" he said. "I'd rather stand." He nodded, accepting this. "We've been looking for Thomas Whitlock since 2 days ago, when one of my deputies found his horse on the west bank of Harlan's Creek. The horse was alive but alone. No rider, no gear, besides what was still in the saddlebag." The kitchen was very quiet. Henry, in his basket, made a small sleeping sound. "The creek's been running high," Alderman continued. "The snow melt from before the storm came, plus the storm itself. There are 2 crossing points on the Harlan that would have been passable a week ago, but weren't passable by the time the storm hit." He paused. "We think he tried to cross." Clara looked at the table, at the grain of the wood. She focused on that because it was specific and concrete, and she could hold it. "We haven't found him," Alderman said. "I want to be clear about that. We haven't found him, and in weather like this, a search isn't possible until conditions improve. But the horse—" He stopped, then started again. "The horse came back alone, Clara. Horses don't do that when the rider is just delayed somewhere." She knew that. She'd grown up around horses her whole life. She knew exactly what a horse coming back alone meant. The grain of the wood. She kept her eyes on it. "I'm sorry," Alderman said. It was a simple statement, not dressed up in anything. "You said you haven't found him," Clara said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "That's right." "So you don't know for certain?" Alderman was quiet for a moment. "That's also right," he said carefully. "We don't know for certain. Not until we can search properly." She looked up from the wood grain and looked at him directly. "Then I'll wait until you know for certain," she said. He held her gaze. He didn't argue with her, which she respected. "All right," he said. "That's fair." The morning moved in the way of mornings in houses where difficult things are happening, with the particular combination of ordinary domestic activity and suspended dread that made kitchens feel both too warm and too close. Margaret nursed May again at 8:30, and this time the baby took 6 minutes, which was an improvement, though Margaret's expression stayed carefully neutral throughout, in a way that told Clara she was not being given the full picture of her own assessment. "More than before," Clara said, watching from her chair. "Yes," Margaret said. "But she's worried," Clara said. Margaret looked at her. "I'm cautious," she said, which was a different word than worried, and also, Clara understood, not the same as reassured. Doc Briggs came back at noon. He listened to May's chest with the instrument he carried, his expression doing the same thing Margaret's did, something happening behind the eyes that wasn't being shared at full volume. "Chest sounds the same," he said. "Not worse? Not better yet." "What does not worse mean in hours?" Clara asked. He looked at her. He seemed to be deciding something. "It means we watch tonight," he said. "If she develops fever, that changes the picture. If she keeps feeding and the temperature holds, that's what we want." He paused. "She's fighting, I can tell you that. Babies that aren't fighting don't eat. She's eating." Clara clung to this. She turned it over and looked at it from different angles to make sure she was reading it right. A baby that is eating is a baby that is choosing, on some level, to continue, and found that the logic held and held on to it. Mercer had spent the morning making himself useful in the quiet way that Clara had come to recognize as his particular manner of occupying space. He'd spoken to Alderman at length outside, then come back in. He'd gotten more condensed milk from the general store, which was a practical action that didn't require any discussion. He'd fixed a broken hinge on Margaret's back door that had apparently been broken for some time, without being asked and without making a point of it. At some point in the early afternoon, he came and sat across from Clara at the kitchen table, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and she said, "You knew, didn't you, when I asked you about the road from Bitterroot, about whether you'd seen him?" Mercer was quiet for a moment. "I suspected," he said. "I didn't know." "But you suspected?" "Yes." She thought about this. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you had two babies keeping alive and a night ahead of you," he said. "And because suspecting isn't the same as knowing, and I wasn't going to say something that might not be true and take away something you needed to get through that night." Clara looked at the table. "I needed to get through it believing he might come back," she said. "Yes," Mercer said. She was quiet for a moment. "I think I knew too," she said. I think I knew on day 5. She stopped. "I didn't have room for it yet." "No," he said. "You didn't." They sat in silence for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had been through enough together that silence between them had become a kind of communication rather than an absence of one. "What happens to us," Clara said, "me and the twins, if they confirm it?" Mercer looked at her steadily. "What do you want to happen?" She almost laughed. He kept doing this, asking her what she wanted, what she'd decided, as if these were real questions with real answers that mattered, as if an 11-year-old orphan's preferences about her own future were something that the world was going to take into account. And the strange thing was that with him, it didn't feel like a manipulation. He was actually asking. "I don't want to go to strangers," she said. "I don't want the twins to go to strangers." "That's fair," he said. "I know there's a children's home in Helena. I've heard people talk about it." She'd heard her parents talk about it, in the careful way that adults talked about things they considered cautionary. "I don't want that for May and Henry." Mercer nodded slowly. "Is there family?" he asked. "My mother had a sister in Ohio. We haven't had a letter from her in 3 years. I don't know if she even... I don't know." Clara looked at her hands. "My father had a brother in Kansas, but they didn't speak. Something happened before I was born that I was never told about." "All right," Mercer said. "What does all right mean?" Clara said. "It means we know what the situation is," he said, "and we deal with what we know." He folded his hands on the table, looked at them for a moment. "Nobody's making decisions today. Today is about May. The rest comes after." She accepted this because it was the most practical framing available and because she genuinely did not have the capacity to think past today. Today was May's chest, May's breathing, May's 4 minutes of feeding becoming 6 minutes, the hope of 8 minutes this afternoon. The afternoon was long. Margaret nursed May at 2 o'clock. 7 minutes this time, Clara counted, sitting in the corner chair with Henry asleep in her lap, her lips moving slightly with the count. 7 minutes, and the baby pulled away herself, not from exhaustion or failure, but with the small, decisive turn of head that meant she'd taken what she wanted. It was a different turn of head. Clara saw it the moment it happened. "That was different," she said. Margaret looked at her, and this time the careful neutrality cracked just slightly at the edges, and what was underneath it was cautious and real, and not the shape of a woman delivering bad news. "Yes," Margaret said. "That was a little different." Clara pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry in front of anyone over the possibility of 7 minutes of nursing being better than 6 minutes of nursing, because that was a ridiculous thing to cry about, and also because if she started, she didn't know where it would stop. She looked out the window instead. The snow had picked up again in the afternoon, not the storm returning, just the ordinary gray winter business of a Montana January, and the street outside was quiet in the way of towns that have battened down and are simply enduring. A man passed the window with his head down. A dog moved across her field of vision and was gone. She thought about the cabin. She thought about the floor she'd slept on, the drawer she'd converted into a cradle, the books she'd burned and her father's handwriting in the margins of the ones he'd loved best. She'd seen it when she was feeding pages to the fire, the small cramped notes he made when something struck him, and she'd made herself not read them because reading them would have undone her, and she thought now that she would never see those words, whatever they were, and this struck her as a specific and distinct loss on top of all the other losses, a small one in the accounting of it, but sharp in a particular way. Mercer came in from outside with cold on his coat and something in his hand, a small paper package from the general store, which he set on the table without comment. Clara looked at it. Peppermint sticks, he said. Thought the girl who's been holding everything together for a week might want something that had no practical purpose whatsoever. Clara looked at him. Then she looked at the package. Then she picked it up and opened it and took out one of the sticks and ate it standing at the table. And it tasted like the exact opposite of everything the last 6 days had tasted like, sweet and clear and immediate. And she finished it without a word, and Mercer sat down and said nothing, which was exactly right. "Thank you," she said when she was done. "You're welcome," he said. The evening took a long time to arrive. Doc Briggs came back at 5:30, examined May with the same methodical thoroughness as before. And this time, when he put the instrument away, there was something different in how he moved. A slight reduction in the tension around his eyes. An almost imperceptible shift in the set of his shoulders. "Her chest is clearer," he said. Clara was very still. "The congestion's loosening. She's warmer, which is what I wanted to see. And Margaret tells me she took 7 minutes at the last feeding." He looked at May, who was sleeping in the small bed with a quality of sleep that was different from the barely there sleep of the morning. A deeper, more committed sleep. The sleep of something investing in itself. "She's not out of the woods. I want another 12 hours before I say she's stable. But she's fighting better than she was this morning, and that matters." "When can I say she's going to be all right?" Clara asked. Briggs looked at her. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "If she eats at 2 o'clock tonight and eats at 6 tomorrow morning and her chest stays clear, tomorrow morning you can start letting yourself believe it." He left. Margaret went to start supper. Mercer was outside seeing to Gideon. Clara sat alone in the kitchen with the 2 sleeping babies, Henry in his basket, May in the small bed by the fire, and the house settling into its evening sounds around her, and she thought, one more night, that was all. One more night of watching and counting and not letting herself rest fully, and then tomorrow morning she could start believing. She could do one more night. She had done 6 already. She did not sleep between midnight and 2 o'clock. She told Margaret she would wake her, but she didn't, because this was the feeding Clara needed to see herself. She needed to watch May eat, needed to count the minutes with her own eyes, needed to not have this particular thing reported to her second hand. She sat in the chair by the fire with a blanket around her shoulders, and the house quiet around her, and she watched May's face in the firelight, and thought about a lot of things she hadn't let herself think about during the day when there were people to be composed in front of. She thought about her mother. Not the Tuesday of her death, but earlier things. The smell of her bread. The particular way she'd read aloud when Clara was small, moving her lips slightly as if she were hearing the words before she said them. The blue square quilt that was now in the snow behind the cabin, which Clara had put there herself. She thought about these things in the direct way that grief sometimes came at you when you stopped moving, not as a wave, but as a steady, accumulating weight. The kind that didn't knock you over, but that you felt in every part of your body. She thought about her father. She thought about him on that horse, riding out into the early snow, and she tried to build the story that Alderman had implied. The high water, the crossing, the wrong decision made in urgency and love, the act of a man trying to get back to his family before time ran out. She tried to make it fit with everything she knew about Thomas Whitlock, and it did fit, actually. It fit exactly. Because her father was precisely the kind of man who would attempt an uncrossable river rather than turn back, and she had always known this about him, had inherited it from him without fully knowing she had until right now. She was angry at him. She was angry at him in the hot, specific way that you could only be angry at someone you loved completely, and she was also not angry at him at all, and both of these things were true at the same time, and she didn't try to resolve them. At 2 o'clock, May woke. Clara lifted her from the bed, the small weight of her, already slightly more substantial than it had been that morning, or perhaps Clara was imagining this because she needed to, and held her in the crook of her arm and did what Margaret had shown her to do, and after a moment's protest, May latched and began to eat. Clara counted. 1 minute, 2, 3. She watched the firelight on the baby's face, on the small hands that had come uncurled from their tight newborn fists and were resting now against Clara's arm with a looseness that meant comfort, meant ease, meant a body that was not bracing itself against everything. 4 minutes, 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes. May pulled away with the decisive head turn at 8 minutes, and Clara sat with her in the firelight and felt the counting stop and felt something unlock in her chest that had been locked since Tuesday. Not all of it, not even most of it, but some corner of the iron mechanism of the last 6 days released, and she breathed, really breathed, for what felt like the first time in a week. 8 minutes, she said quietly to May, who was not aware of the significance of this number. May looked at her with the dark, unfocused gaze of a newborn, finding the shape of a face, and Clara looked back. "You're going to be fine," Clara said. "You understand? That's just how this is going to go. You're going to be fine." It was still not a guarantee. She knew that. Tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, and then Briggs with his instrument and his careful eyes, and then she would know more. But 8 minutes of eating at 2 in the morning from a baby who had arrived in Bitterroot barely breathing was not a small thing. She put May back in the small bed and covered her and watched until the breathing settled into the deep rhythm of real sleep. And then she sat back and Henry made a noise in his basket and she went and checked him. Still fine, still aggrieved in his general manner, still breathing with the aggressive competence of someone who had decided survival was a personal challenge. And she covered him again and went back to her chair. The fire needed a piece of wood. She got up and fed it and sat back down. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Outside, the snow fell quietly against the window, the soft, ordinary snow of a winter that was simply being winter without malice. The kitchen was warm. Both babies were breathing. In the morning, Briggs would come and listen to May's chest and tell her what he found, and then she would know more. She sat in the chair and she did not sleep, and she did not need to, because for the first time since Tuesday, she was not keeping watch out of pure desperate necessity. She was keeping watch out of something different, something quieter, something she didn't quite have the word for yet. The particular quality of a person who has been through the worst stretch and come out the other side still standing, still counting, still here. At 6 o'clock, the house began to wake. Margaret's footsteps in the hall, the smell of coffee starting, Henry beginning his morning complaint. Outside, the first gray light of a January dawn coming over the Montana sky. May woke at 6:15, and Clara lifted her, and at 6:17 May began to eat again. Clara counted. 9 minutes. Briggs arrived at 7, earlier than he'd said, which she took as either a good sign or a worrying one, and wouldn't know which until she saw his face. She was holding May when he came in, the baby fed and quiet against her shoulder, and the doctor looked at them both, and something in his face was different from yesterday evening, and Clara made herself wait for him to say it rather than asking. He took the instrument from his bag. He listened to May's chest. He listened for a long time, moving the instrument to several places, his face giving nothing. Clara watched his face while he listened the way she'd watched her father's face when he was judging weather, looking for the sign in it. He put the instrument away. "Clear," he said. "Both lungs. Clear." He looked at her. "She ate this morning?" 9 minutes, at 2 and at 6. He was quiet for a moment. Then something happened to his face that was, she understood, as close to a smile as this particular man got, while still on the working side of professional. "I think she's going to be all right," he said. Clara did not cry. She had told herself she wouldn't, and she didn't, but it was a near thing. She felt the back of her throat close up, felt the pressure behind her eyes, felt everything that had been sitting behind the door all week lean hard against it. And she stood there with May against her shoulder and breathed through it until it passed. "You're sure?" she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "As sure as I get," he said. "She needs to keep eating. She needs to stay warm. She needs the next week to go without incident. But what I'm hearing in her chest right now is a baby who has decided to stay." He paused. "She's stubborn. That'll serve her well out here." "She's a Whitlock," Claire said. "We're all stubborn." And that small statement, the matter-of-fact, unperformed way she said it, as if she were simply stating a family characteristic the way someone might mention eye color or height, was the thing that finally, quietly, made Clara May Whitlock's face do something that it had not done in 6 days. She smiled. Not the large, relieved, overwhelming kind, just the small, tired, real kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that just appears because the face can't help it, because something in the body has decided that the ledger has shifted and this particular moment deserves to be marked with something other than endurance. Henry, from his basket, registered his opinion of the morning at volume. "That one's got opinions," Briggs said. "He always has," Claire said. She went and picked up Henry too, one baby in each arm, and stood in Margaret Hale's kitchen in Bitterroot, Montana, On a January morning with the snow coming down outside and the fire warm behind her and both babies in her arms, and she thought, they're both here. We all three made it here. It was not the end of anything. It was nowhere near the end. There was still everything else waiting, all the things she hadn't had room for yet, all the questions about what happened next and where they went and what the world looked like without Thomas Whitlock in it. All of that was waiting, patient as winter, just outside the door. But right now, in this moment, both babies were here, and both babies were breathing, and May had eaten 9 minutes, and her lungs were clear, and Clara stood in the warmth with her arms full and let herself have the morning. Just the morning. That was enough for right now. That was more than enough. 3 days passed in Margaret Hale's house before Clara fully understood what rest felt like again. Not the collapsed, desperate unconsciousness of those first nights, the kind that wasn't really rest at all, but just the body shutting down because it had no choice left, but actual sleep. The kind where you went under and stayed under and woke up in the same position you'd started in, which meant your body had trusted the world enough to stop bracing itself even in sleep. She woke on the third morning and lay still for a moment, listening, and heard both babies in the kitchen making the sounds that meant alive and fed and present, and she thought, this is what it feels like when the emergency is over. It didn't feel the way she'd expected. She'd thought relief would feel bigger, more like something arriving. It felt instead like something leaving, the particular hollow that a sustained crisis leaves behind when it finally releases you, the way your hands ache when you've been gripping something tightly for too long and you finally let go. May was gaining, not dramatically, not in the way that made for easy reassurance, but in the careful, incremental way of something that had nearly not made it and was now, with absolute stubbornness, making it. Her feeding times lengthened each day, 10 minutes by day 2, 12 by day 3, with Margaret nursing her on a schedule that she maintained with the precision of someone who understood that regularity was itself a kind of medicine. Doc Briggs came each morning, listened to the small chest, and each morning his expression was fractionally less guarded than the day before, which Clara read as accurately as a weather sign. Henry, who had never needed anyone's worry on his behalf, ate with the focused ambition of someone who considered growth a competitive activity. It was Margaret who first said what Clara had been circling around since the morning Briggs had said clear, and something had shifted. She said it on the third evening, after supper, when the babies were settled and Mercer had gone to the boarding house where he'd taken a room for reasons he hadn't explained but which Clara understood. He wasn't leaving, not yet, and he hadn't said why, and she hadn't asked, and it was just the two of them at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. Frank Alderman is going to come tomorrow, Margaret said. She said it simply, without build-up. He's got more information about your father. Clara looked at her hands on the table. How much more? I don't know all of it, Margaret said, but I know they found something at the creek. The kitchen was warm. From the back room, faintly, she could hear Henry making the small sounds he made in light sleep. Not distress, just presence. The constant low-grade announcement of himself that he seemed to maintain even unconscious. May was quiet. All right, Clara said. Margaret looked at her for a moment. I can be here when he talks to you, if you want. Clara thought about this. Yes, she said. I'd like that. She went to bed soon after, and she lay in the dark in the back room and thought about Harlan's Creek. She'd crossed it once, 2 summers ago, on the way to a neighbor's harvest gathering, sitting up front on the wagon seat beside her father. She remembered the sound of it, the muscular green push of water over the rocks, her father's hand steady on the reins as the horses picked their way through. She remembered him saying, always respect moving water, Clara. It doesn't care about your plans. She lay in the dark and thought about this, and thought about the horse coming back alone, and thought about her father on the bank of a flooded creek making a calculation, the same kind of calculation she had made over and over in the cabin, the kind where all the options were bad and you picked the least bad one. And she understood, even before Alderman told her anything, what the calculation had been. He had looked at the water, and he had looked at the road back, and he had thought about Ruth and the twins and the storm that was coming, and he had thought, if I don't cross now, I won't make it back in time. And he had crossed. It was exactly what she would have done. She fell asleep understanding this, and it was not comfort, not yet, but it was something. The beginning of the shape of something. Alderman arrived at 9 in the morning with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who had prepared what he was going to say, and was not sure the preparation was going to be sufficient. Margaret sat at one end of the table. Clara sat across from Alderman. Mercer was there too. She'd sent word to the boarding house that morning without quite deciding to, and he'd come without comment and taken a position near the window, which was where he always seemed to put himself when something difficult was happening, as if he understood that his job was to be present, but not central. "We found Thomas Whitlock," Alderman said. He said it straight, which she appreciated. 2 miles downstream from the east crossing at Harlan's Creek, yesterday afternoon when the water dropped enough to search. The kitchen received this in silence. He was... Alderman stopped, started again. It was the crossing. The east bank had given way with the high water. It would have looked passable from the west side. It would have looked like the crossing he'd used before. But the bank edge wasn't stable, and when the horse stepped onto it, he paused. "We believe the horse threw him when the bank gave way. The horse made it back. Your father went into the current." Clara sat very still. "He didn't leave," she said. "No," Alderman said. He did not leave. She had known this, had been building toward knowing it since the night she'd lain in the dark and traced his logic from the inside. But hearing it from Alderman in this kitchen made it real in a different way. The way that things became real when they were said aloud by someone official, someone whose job was the truth of events. He didn't leave. He went into the water trying to get back. The distinction felt enormous. It was enormous. For 6 days she had held, in some locked compartment of herself, the alternative, the possibility she hadn't let herself articulate, but that had been there anyway, in the shape of the 6th day and the 7th, in the silence where his return should have been. The possibility that he had known what was coming and had chosen not to come back to it. She hadn't believed it, but it had been there, the way terrible possibilities were there even when you didn't believe them, taking up space. Alderman closed that door, closed it and locked it, and gave her the key. He had the doctor's bag with him, Alderman continued, his voice careful. "Doc Harlan from Bitterroot Creek. Harlan confirmed your father came to his door and asked him to ride back with him. Harlan said the storm was already setting in and he wasn't willing to travel in those conditions, that he'd given your father what he could and told him to wait it out." Alderman paused. "Your father didn't wait." "No," Clara said. "He wouldn't. Harlan gave him a kit, supplies for a berth, some medicine, instructions written down in case..." Alderman stopped. "He was trying to get back with what he could carry. He made it most of the way." Most of the way. Clara held those 3 words and turned them over. Most of the way was not all the way, and all the way was what she'd needed, and she was old enough and honest enough to hold both of these things simultaneously, her gratitude for the truth of him, and her grief for the fact of him, the love and the anger and the loss all present at the same time, tangled together in the way that real feeling was tangled, nothing clean about it, nothing resolved. "What happens now?" Clara said. With him." "He'll be buried here," Alderman said. "Bitterroot has a cemetery. We'll see to it properly, if that's all right with you." "Here," Clara said, and then something occurred to her that hit harder than she expected. "My mother is at the cabin. I put her outside. I covered her, but I couldn't. The ground was too frozen." Margaret made a soft sound across the table. "We'll see to her too," Alderman said gently. "When the ground thaws. Both of them together, if you want that." Clara hadn't thought about whether she wanted that. She thought about it now. Her parents, who had followed each other to Montana Territory, who had built the cabin and the fence and the idea of a life together in the mountains, yes. Together made sense. Together was what they'd been. "Together," she said. "Yes?" Alderman nodded. He looked like he had more to say and wasn't sure how to say it, and Clara waited for him because she'd learned in the last week that waiting was often more effective than asking. "There's the matter of you and the children," he said. "The cabin is yours. Your father held the deed. But a cabin 15 miles out in winter is not," he chose his next words carefully, "is not a suitable situation for 3 children, one of whom is an infant still recovering and one of whom is a newborn." "I know that," Clara said. "The county has procedures for..." "I know what the county has procedures for," Clara said. Not rudely, just clearly. "I don't want that." Alderman looked at her. "Miss Whitlock, you are 11 years old. You cannot..." "I know how old I am," she said. "I'm not saying I can do it alone. I'm saying I don't want strangers." She looked at the table and then back at him. Is there a way to do this that doesn't involve the county procedures? Alderman was quiet. Family, he said. If there's family willing to take responsibility, that would change things. He paused. Is there family? Clara thought of what she'd told Mercer, the aunt in Ohio who hadn't written in 3 years, the uncle in Kansas her father hadn't spoken to. She started to say this and then stopped, because Mercer had shifted slightly near the window, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and he said nothing, and she thought, he hasn't left. He has been here for 3 days, and he hasn't left, and he fixed Margaret's hinge, and he got condensed milk and peppermint sticks, and he sat up all night with May against his chest. She didn't say anything to him. She just held the look for a moment and then looked back at Alderman. I need some time, she said. Alderman nodded slowly. You have some, he said. Not unlimited, but some. He stood, settled his hat back on his head. I'm sorry about your parents, Clara, both of them. Your father was trying to do right by his family. I want you to know that's what the evidence shows, clear as anything. I know, she said. He left, and the room was quiet for a moment. And then Henry contributed his assessment of the morning from the back room, and Margaret stood to go to him, and Clara sat at the table alone with Mercer near the window, and neither of them spoke for a while. You fixed her hinge, Clara said finally. He looked at her. It was broken. You've been here 3 days. I know how long I've been here. She looked at the table. You said you don't stay in one place anymore, that houses have too many corners. That's what I said, he agreed. Why are you still here? He was quiet for a moment, looked at the window, at the street outside, at nothing in particular. Then he looked back at her with the tired eyes that had been tired when she first saw them, and were maybe, by some degree, she couldn't be certain of, a little less tired now. Because I don't want to leave, he said. And I haven't wanted to not leave a place in a long time, so I'm paying attention to it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Alderman's going to want an answer about what happens to us, she said. I know. I'm not asking you for anything, she said. It was important to her that this was clear. She was not a girl who intended to maneuver people into things, or use the babies as leverage, or make a man feel trapped by the logic of what he'd already done. I want to be clear about that. I know you're not, he said. I'm just telling you what the situation is. I understand the situation, Mercer said. I understood the situation when I knocked on that cabin door. He paused. I'd like to talk about it, if you're willing. Not today, necessarily, but soon. Today is fine, Clara said. I'd rather know things than not know them. He looked at her for a moment, and something in his face shifted, not dramatically, but in the way of someone who has been braced for a conversation and found it less resistant than expected. All right, he said. Today then. So, they talked for 2 hours. Margaret came in and out, feeding May, checking Henry, moving around the edges of the conversation with the tact of a woman who understood that some things needed to happen in her kitchen and that her job was to let them happen. It was not a smooth conversation. There were long pauses. There were places where one of them said something and then had to correct it, or where the logic of something came up against the emotional reality of it, and both of them had to sit with the collision for a minute before moving forward. Mercer was not a man who spoke easily about personal things. She'd understood this about him from the first night, when had a wife, don't anymore had been the entirety of his history. And Clara was not a child who trusted easily, though she trusted more than she had a week ago, because a week ago had rearranged several things. What emerged from those 2 hours was not a plan, exactly. It was more like the framework of a possibility. Mercer had money. Not a great deal, but some, set aside over 7 years of freight work and careful living, because a man who has nothing to spend on and nowhere in particular to be tends to accumulate modest savings simply through the absence of things to spend them on. He owned a small property outside of Bitterroot, a house actually, though he'd been using it as a storage depot for freight and hadn't lived in it properly in 3 years. It had 3 rooms and a sound roof and a wood stove that worked, and it was 4 miles from town. The cabin, the Whitlock cabin, Clara's cabin, could be sold or held. That was a decision for later, when Clara was old enough to make it with full understanding of what she was giving up or keeping. The freight work was what it was. He couldn't stop it. It was his income and his livelihood, but Bitterroot was on his regular circuit, which meant the base of his operations could reasonably be relocated here without significant loss. He would still be gone for stretches. He was honest about this. He was not going to pretend it was otherwise to make the proposal more appealing, because he didn't want to build a thing on a false foundation. Clara listened to all of this with the attention she'd been giving to complicated situations her whole life. Not just the words, but the shape of the reasoning behind them. The places where a person's logic revealed what they actually thought versus what they were trying to say. "Why?" she said, when he'd finished. He looked at her. "Why what? Why do you want to do this? You had a life before you stopped at the cabin. You had a route and a circuit and a way of being that was working for you." She looked at him directly. "You could have brought us to Bitterroot and gone on." Mercer was quiet for a long moment. "When I picked up May in the cabin," he said. "That night she went cold. I held her." He stopped, tried again. "I haven't held anything that mattered like that in 7 years. I'd forgotten what it felt like to—" He paused, looking for the right word, and didn't find it, and settled for the imprecise one. "To matter to something that specific, something that present." He looked at his hands. "I'm not saying that's a good reason. I'm not saying it's sufficient. I'm saying that's what's true." Clara thought about this for a while. "You know I'm not going to be easy," she said. "I'm not the kind of child that's easy." "I'd noticed," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite humor, but was in the same neighborhood. "Henry's going to be loud. He's always going to be loud. May is— I don't know what May is going to be yet. I'm only beginning to know her." She paused. "And I'm still angry. About my parents. I'm going to be angry for a while, and I'm not always going to know where to put it." "That's fair," he said. "It might come out in your direction sometimes, even when it's not about you." "I know how anger works," he said. "And I'm going to have opinions about things," she said, "about how the babies are raised and what they're taught, and I was there from the beginning with them. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't." "I wouldn't expect you to," Mercer said, "and I wouldn't want you to." She sat back in her chair and looked at him. This large, patched, weathered man who had knocked on a door in a blizzard and not left when he could have and would not win any prizes for ease of conversation, and she thought about what her father would have said about him. Her father, who had believed in hard work and good books, and in the kind of person who didn't need to announce what kind of person they were because their actions had already done it. She thought Thomas Whitlock would have liked Elias Mercer. Not immediately. Her father had not been a man for immediate judgments, but eventually. In the particular way of two men who were more alike than different, recognizing the resemblance in each other. "I'm not going to call you anything," she said. "I mean, I'm not going to call you father or anything like that. You're not my father." "No," Mercer said. "I'm not. I'll call you Mercer." "That's what you've been calling me." "I know. I'm just saying I'm going to keep doing it." "All right," he said. She looked at the table, then back at him. "I think this could work," she said. "I'm not certain. I don't think you're certain either." "I'm not," he said. "No." "But I think it could work," she said again. And in saying it twice, she was not trying to convince herself or him. She was acknowledging the difference between certainty and possibility and choosing possibility, which she understood was always how these things started. She went to her father's burial on a clear Thursday morning, 6 days after arriving in Bitterroot. The ground was still hard in places, but aldermen had arranged for it to be managed, and there was a spot in the Bitterroot cemetery at the eastern edge of town, under a pine tree that would provide shade in summer, though shade was not the pressing concern at the moment. 6 people came, besides Clara: Alderman, Mercer, Margaret Hale with her baby on her hip, Doc Briggs, the minister from the small church who Clara had asked to be brief and factual, and who seemed to understand what she meant, and a man named Peterson who had known Thomas Whitlock from the trading post, and who stood at the back with his hat in his hands and said nothing, but whose presence Clara found she was moved by. This stranger's choice to come and stand in the cold for a man he'd known only casually, as the simple acknowledgement that Thomas Whitlock had existed and had been known and was being mourned. The twins were not there. They were with Margaret's older daughter, back at the house, being minded with the competence of a 14-year-old who had grown up helping with babies and knew what she was doing. Clara had thought about bringing them, about the symbolism of it, the twins who had been the reason Thomas Whitlock had ridden into the storm, and had decided against it because the cold was wrong for May, and also because she thought her father would have said, "Take care of the living first, the ceremony can be simple." The minister was, true to his word, brief. He said the right things, that Thomas Whitlock had been a man who loved his family and had proven it in the manner of his death, that the manner of dying was less important than the manner of living, that a man who rode 2 days through bad weather to bring a doctor back to his wife was a man whose priorities were clear, and that clarity of priority was something worth saying aloud over a grave. Clara stood with her hands at her sides and her coat buttoned to the top. And she listened, and she did not cry. She had a feeling the crying would come later, privately, in increments she could manage. But she was present in a way she hadn't been able to be in the cabin, hadn't been able to afford to be, because the cabin had required her to be functional and functional and functional, and here, now, she could just be a daughter. Just that. Just his daughter, standing in the cold, saying goodbye. When it was over, Mercer stood beside her while the others drifted back toward the road, and he didn't say anything, which was right. And she stood there for another minute, looking at the disturbed earth under the pine and thinking about all the margins of all the books and what had been written in them that she would never read now. "He would have liked you," she said finally. Mercer looked at the grave. "I'd have liked him," he said. She thought that was probably true. She thought her father and Mercer would have found each other in the particular way of men who don't talk much but recognize something in each other's silences. "He wrote in his books," she said, "in the margins. I burned them for heat, and I didn't read the margins first." She paused. "I made the right choice. I know I made the right choice, but I wish—" She stopped. "Yeah," Mercer said. That was all. Just yeah, because it was the right response. The response that didn't try to fix or reframe or console, that just acknowledged that the loss was the loss, and some parts of it were specific, and those specific parts deserved to be named. They walked back to Margaret's house together in the thin winter light, not talking, and Clara thought about what the next weeks looked like, helping Mercer get the storage house into a shape that could hold a family, which was going to require work, and probably the kind of arguments that came from two people with different ideas about what things should look like. Margaret had already said she'd help, and she'd meant it, and Clara was beginning to understand that Margaret Hale was the kind of person who said what she meant and followed it with actions, which was rare enough to be worth noticing. There was a letter to write, too, to her mother's sister in Ohio. She didn't know if the woman was still at the same address, didn't know if the letter would arrive or be answered, but she'd decided that she would write it anyway, not to ask for help, not to plead her case, but simply because her mother's sister deserved to know what had happened to Ruth Whitlock, and because withholding information from someone who might care felt wrong, and because her parents had raised her to do the harder right thing rather than the easier nothing. And there was the matter of herself, her own age, her own education, her own future in a place where the future was by no means guaranteed to anyone and had to be made from what you could carry and what you could learn and who was standing near you when the hard parts happened. She was 11 years old. She had delivered her own siblings and kept them alive for a week in a frozen cabin and brought them 15 miles through a blizzard and had not, through all of it, lost track of what mattered. She didn't know what that made her. Not extraordinary. She didn't think extraordinary was the right word, because extraordinary implied that most people in her situation would have done differently, and she wasn't sure that was true. She thought most people, given no other option, would do what they had to do. She'd had no other option. She thought it made her her. Clara May Whitlock, 11 years old, not easy, not finished, not certain about most things, but present, still counting. The conversation with aldermen about the county procedures happened the following afternoon, with Mercer present, and went more smoothly than Clara had expected, not because Alderman was easily moved, but because he was, she discovered, a practical man who preferred workable arrangements to theoretical correctness, and a workable arrangement was what Mercer and Clara had put together. It was not without conditions. Alderman made clear that he would be checking in, that the house needed to be fit before they could move into it, that Clara would be enrolled in schooling. Bitterroot had a school teacher who handled 12 children ranging from 6 to 15 in a single room, and attendance was not optional, that May's health would be monitored by Briggs for the next month at minimum. Clara agreed to all of this without argument, because it was all reasonable, and because she'd learned that adults who had reasonable expectations were less exhausting than adults who had unreasonable ones, and Alderman's expectations were reasonable. "One more thing," Alderman said when they'd worked through the practical matters. He looked at Clara. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "All right," she said. "Are you choosing this because it's what you want, or because it's the best option you can see?" Clara looked at him. It was a good question. It was the kind of question that deserved a real answer rather than the one that would satisfy him most quickly. "I don't know if there's a difference yet," she said, "between what I want and the best option. I think what I want is for the twins to be safe, and for us to stay together, and for Mercer to stop looking like a man who's waiting to be told he has to leave." She paused. "This does all of those things. Maybe that's what wanting something is sometimes. Maybe it's just recognizing when a thing fits." Alderman looked at her for a long moment. "Your father must have been something," he said quietly. "Yes," Clara said. "He was." Alderman closed his notebook, capped his pen, and stood to leave, and Mercer walked him to the door, and Clara sat at the table and looked at the lamp and thought about fitting, about the odd, imperfect, unasked-for shape of the arrangement she had somehow arrived at, this collection of people who had come together through catastrophe and cold, and a freight driver who followed smoke to a cabin because something in him said to, and whether the things built from catastrophe could be solid, could hold. She thought they could. She thought they could be the kind of solid that had something to do with being tested before it was relied on. From the back room, May made a sound. Not distress, not crying, just the small vocal inventory that she'd begun making in the last 2 days, the sound of a baby discovering that she had a voice, and that it functioned and that it got responses. Clara heard it and stood automatically, and then caught herself, because Margaret was in there and Margaret was fine, and she didn't have to move for every sound. She sat back down. Then she stood up again and went anyway, because she wanted to, and wanting to, that small specific want, felt like something worth following. May was awake in the small bed, dark eyes moving across the ceiling with the focused vagueness of a baby taking inventory of the world above her. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at her, and May's gaze eventually found Clara's face and settled there. And Clara thought about the name she'd given her, the half of herself she'd folded into the baby's identity on a frozen wagon road because she needed this child to carry some stubbornness into the world. And she thought, "You're here. We are here. Both of us, all three of us, because we were too stubborn to be anything else." May made the small vocal sound again, directed upward at nothing in particular, or maybe at everything. "I know," Clara said. "I know." And she stayed there, sitting on the edge of the bed in Margaret Hale's warm house in Bitterroot, Montana, with the afternoon light coming through the yellow curtains, and Henry beginning his commentary on the state of things from the kitchen, and Mercer's voice low and steady somewhere in the house. And she sat with her sister and let the afternoon be what it was, quiet, imperfect, and for the first time in a long time, not something she had to survive, just something she was in. The house outside Bitterroot had been used as a freight depot for 3 years, and it showed. Mercer had warned her. He'd said the words, "It needs work," in the careful tone of a man who knew that it needs work was doing considerable lifting as a description. And Clara had said she understood, and then she'd walked through the door on a February morning 2 weeks after arriving in Bitterroot and stood in the main room and looked at the stacked crates and the water stain on the north wall and the window with the cracked pane that had been stuffed with burlap against the cold. And she'd thought, "This is fine. This is a problem I can see, which means it's a problem I can work on. And working on problems I can see is something I know how to do." She had become, she was discovering, a person with a high tolerance for difficult and a low tolerance for vague. The last 2 months had done that to her, or perhaps had revealed it. She wasn't sure which. Maybe both. They moved in on the 1st of March, when the worst of winter had pulled back enough that the idea of a 4-mile wagon ride with 2 infants no longer felt like a deliberate tempting of fate. Margaret Hale came with them that first day and spent 4 hours helping arrange the back room into something that could reasonably be called a nursery, a word that made Clara feel the particular dissonance of being 11 years old in charge of a nursery. And when she left, she hugged Clara in the straightforward way she had, no excess sentiment, just the firm and genuine pressure of a woman who meant it. 4 miles, Margaret said. Not far. Not far, Clara agreed. And it wasn't. That turned out to matter more than Clara had anticipated. The 4 miles between the house and Bitterroot, the fact that Margaret was at the end of them, and Briggs was at the end of them, and the school was at the end of them, and the general store and alderman's office, and all the ordinary infrastructure of a place where people knew her name now, and knew her story, and had made, in their various ways, the decision to be useful rather than curious about it. The cracked window got replaced in the first week. Mercer did it himself on a Saturday. cutting the new pane with a tool Clara hadn't seen before, and setting it with a steadiness of hand that she filed away as one more thing he was competent at without announcing. The water stain on the north wall turned out to be from a gap in the chinking that he also fixed, mixing the mud and straw compound outside in the cold, with the patience of a man who understood that the cold didn't care about his schedule and adjusted accordingly. Clara scrubbed the floors. She cooked. Not well, not yet, but adequately, which was its own form of progress. She learned the wood stove's particular temperament, the way it needed the damper set at a specific angle to draw right, the way it ran hot on the left side and cooler on the right, the way it forgave inconsistency in the morning better than in the evening. She learned these things the way she'd learned most things in her life, by paying attention and making mistakes and adjusting. She started school on a Wednesday in the second week of March, arriving with Henry on her back in a carrier Margaret had helped her construct, and May in a basket that she set near the stove in the schoolroom with the teachers, Miss Adler's, somewhat stunned permission. Miss Adler was 24 and from Pennsylvania and had not, in her 2 years of teaching on the Montana frontier, encountered a student who arrived with 2 infants in tow. But she was a pragmatic woman who had chosen frontier teaching specifically because she found the expected less interesting than the unexpected. And after the first day, she'd simply incorporated the babies into the rhythm of the room, pausing when Henry made noise and continuing when he subsided. The other students, ranging from 6-year-old Will Penny to 15-year-old Grace Alderman, the sheriff's daughter, received Clara with the mixture of curiosity and provisional acceptance that children offered newcomers. And Clara received them back with the measured attention of someone who had learned that people revealed themselves more in their small actions than in their introductions. She was neither eager to be liked nor indifferent to it. She wanted to understand who she was among. That was all. Grace Alderman was the one who came closest to something like friendship in those first weeks. She was 4 years older and already possessed of a competence and self-possession that Clara recognized in the way you recognize something of yourself in another person. Grace had been helping her father with his paperwork since she was 9, and she read with the focused absorption of someone for whom reading was not a school activity, but a private necessity. She arrived one afternoon in late March with a book from her own shelf, a collection of frontier accounts, written by women, and handed it to Clara without ceremony. "My father said you like books," she said. Clara looked at the book. "I burned ours for heat," she said. Grace considered this. "Then you need them more than I do." Clara kept the book for 2 weeks and returned it, and Grace brought another, and this was how it started. Not through any declaration of friendship, but through the simple repeated action of one person offering another person something they needed, which was, Clara was coming to understand, how most of the real things in her life had started. Mercer left for the first time in April. He'd warned her. He'd told her in February that the spring freight circuit would take him north for 3 weeks, maybe 4, and that he'd make arrangements. Mrs. Gunderson from town would come by every other day. Briggs would check the twins at his regular schedule, and Margaret was 4 miles away and had made Clara promise to send word for anything, which was Margaret's word for anything, and which Clara understood to mean it sincerely. She understood all of this. She'd said she understood. And when the wagon pulled out on a Tuesday morning in April, with Gideon's big hooves working through the mud, and Mercer's hand raised once in a backward acknowledgement as he went, she stood on the step and watched until the wagon was gone, and then went inside and fed May and thought, well, here we are again. It was not the same as January. She was clear on that. She had firewood and sound walls and a working stove and condensed milk in the cupboard and a town 4 miles away, and a list of people who would come if she sent word. She had, in the language of practical survival, everything she'd lacked before. But the aloneness had a familiar texture to it, and she sat with it the first evening without trying to make it into something it wasn't. She was not fine, exactly. She was managing, which was different. She was 12 years old. Her birthday had come and gone in February with a small cake from Margaret and a book from Mercer that he'd ordered from somewhere, a real book, the kind her father would have liked, and which she'd held for a long time before opening. And she was managing a household and 2 infants and a school attendance that Miss Adler tracked with the precision of someone who considered it important. And she was doing all of this adequately, which was not the same as easily. She was angry at Mercer the first week he was gone. She recognized the anger as partly unfair and was angry at it for being unfair and was angry at him anyway because being fair about your feelings didn't make them stop. She'd told him she understood the freight work. She did understand it. She was still angry. She thought about what he'd said in the cabin. Movement helped for a while. And she thought about whether he was leaving because the house had started to have corners that meant something. And whether that was her and the babies that had done that, and whether that was a good thing or whether she'd done to him what she'd worried about, tied him to something he'd eventually need to move away from. She was still thinking about this when his first letter arrived, which was 8 days after he'd left, and which was, for a man who she'd suspected thought letters were something other people did, surprisingly long. 2 full pages in handwriting that was careful and slightly cramped, the handwriting of someone who'd taught himself and was aware of not having been properly taught. He wrote about the road conditions and Gideon's mood in the mud and a family he'd stayed with one night who had 6 children and a philosophy about frontier life that he disagreed with on 3 specific points, which he outlined. He asked after May's weight and Henry's volume. He asked how school was. He said he'd found something in a trading post that he thought she'd like and he'd bring it back. He did not say he missed them. He described instead the particular quality of the light on the mountain road at 6 in the morning and the way Gideon had refused a crossing on a Tuesday that Mercer had initially argued with him about, and then realized the horse was right. He described things. She understood, reading it, that for this man describing was the same as missing, that the act of writing down what he was seeing was the act of wishing someone was there to see it with him. She wrote back the same day she received it, 4 pages, and did not question the 4 pages. He came back in late May, 3 weeks and 2 days after he'd left. On a Thursday evening when the light was still going at 8 o'clock the way it did in late spring in Montana, long and gold across the flat ground. She heard Gideon before she saw the wagon, and she was on the step when they came up the road, and she did not run out to meet him because she was 12 and had her dignity. But she was on the step when he pulled up and he looked at her, and she looked at him and he said, "How'd they do?" "May gained 4 ounces, she said. Henry bit the school teacher." Something that was definitely a smile crossed his face. "Did she deserve it?" "No," Clara said. "He doesn't discriminate." He climbed down from the wagon and went to see to Gideon, and Clara went inside to finish supper, and Henry heard Mercer come in and produced a sound that was different from his usual sounds, louder, pitched differently, the sound of recognition. And Mercer picked him up and held him without making a speech about it, and May from her basket made her small vocal inventory sound. And the kitchen had all 4 of them in it again, and it was not smooth, it was crowded and loud, and the supper burned slightly on the left side of the stove, and Clara served it anyway, and Mercer ate it without comment, and she thought, this is what it is. This specific, imperfect, loud, slightly burned thing, this is what we have. She thought it was enough. She thought it was, in fact, more than enough. Her mother's sister wrote in June. The letter had taken 4 months to arrive, which suggested it had gone to the cabin first and been redirected, or had sat in the Bitterroot post office for a while before anyone thought to bring it to Clara. The woman's name was Dorothea, which Clara had known, and she lived still in Akron, Ohio, which Clara had not been certain of. The letter was 3 pages and not easy to read, not because of the handwriting, which was neat, but because Dorothea wrote the way people wrote when they were trying to be measured about something that was making them the opposite of measured, the sentences careful and slightly stiff in the way of controlled feeling. She said she was devastated about Ruth. She said she had always been afraid this would happen. The mountains, the winters, the distance from any real help. And she did not say I told her so, but it was there in the negative space between the sentences, the way unexpressed things were always in negative space. She said she wanted to know about the children. She said she was a widow herself, 3 years now, with a grown son in Cleveland and a house that was too large. She said, and this was the sentence Clara read 3 times, that if Clara wanted to bring the babies east, she would take them. Clara sat with this letter for a long time. She sat with it over 2 days, reading it in parts, putting it down, picking it up again. She thought about Akron, Ohio, which she had never seen but which she imagined as green and flat, and entirely different from the mountain valleys where she had been born and where her parents were buried and where May had chosen to live when she could have done otherwise. She thought about Dorothea, who she'd met once, when she was 4, and who she remembered as a woman who smelled like lavender and had very neat hair and had seemed to Clara even at 4 to be a person of considerable opinions. She thought about what it would mean to go. Safety that wasn't made from stubbornness. A school in a real building with more than one teacher. A woman who had known her mother and could tell her things. The things that daughters needed to know about their mothers. The things that died with parents if no one else held them. She thought about what it would mean to stay. She wrote to Dorothea on the third day. It took her 4 attempts to get the letter right, and the right version was not the longest one. It was the third page of the longest one, stripped of everything that was trying too hard to explain itself. She said, "I am glad to know you are there, and that you knew my mother and I would like to write to you, and I would like to know things about her that I don't know." She said, "The twins are here, and they are going to stay here, and I am going to stay with them, because this is where we are from, and this is where our parents are buried, and this is where the people are who helped us when we needed it." She said, "But I would like to know you, if that is possible from this distance. And I would like the twins to know that they have family in Ohio, and I think my mother would have wanted that." She did not apologize for the decision. She did not make it longer than it needed to be. She sent it and did not second-guess it, because she'd learned that second-guessing was most dangerous when the decision had already been made correctly, and you were just looking for ways to undermine yourself. Summer came to the Montana Valley the way it always did. Suddenly, as if winter had simply lost interest and moved on to something else. And the house outside Bitterroot became, in the way of houses where living is actually happening, something layered and particular and harder to imagine empty. May learned to hold her head up in June. It was a small thing, the kind of developmental milestone that would have gone unremarked in another household, but Clara watched it happen, the baby's neck muscles finding their purpose, the head lifting and wobbling and lifting again with the focused effort of someone doing something genuinely difficult, and felt the same quality of satisfaction she'd felt at 9 minutes of nursing, at 8 minutes, at Clear Lungs. The satisfaction of something being attempted and achieved. The satisfaction of stubbornness paying off in the most literal possible way. Henry, predictably, had been holding his head up since what Briggs estimated was 3 weeks earlier than expected, and had greeted this achievement with the same aggressive confidence with which he approached everything. He was going to be a person with opinions, Briggs said, and Clara said she was aware of this, and Briggs said it with the tone of a man delivering news, and Clara said she'd known it since approximately the 2nd hour of his life. Mercer made 2 more freight runs that summer, 4 weeks and then 6 weeks, and the letters went back and forth with a regularity that settled into something she relied on, not because she needed permission or instruction from him, but because the letters were the form their relationship took when he was gone, and she'd come to find them one of the more honest forms of communication available. Because letters didn't have the same pressure as conversation, didn't require you to respond before you'd thought, gave you the space to say the thing you actually meant instead of the thing that arrived first. In one letter, she told him about burning the books and the margins she'd never read, and he wrote back about his son, small things, the way the boy had lined up rocks by size along the fence because he liked order, the way he'd been afraid of nothing except spiders, the way his laugh had sounded. And Clara understood that he was offering this to her the way she'd offered the books, showing her a loss in return for one she'd shown him, making them even in the particular way of people who were building trust the slow, careful way, piece by piece. She wrote, "I think about them all the time. Your wife and son, my parents. I don't think that goes away. I think we just build more around it until it's something we can carry instead of something that's carrying us." He wrote back, "That's right. That's exactly right. I didn't know how to say that." She was 12 years old, and she didn't know how she knew it either, except that the last 6 months had been a sustained education in what grief actually was, not the dramatic thing it was made out to be in the stories her mother had read to her, but the slow and specific work of continuing to live while carrying something heavy, of making breakfast and feeding babies and going to school and writing letters and fixing window panes, all while the weight was there. All while some part of you was always still in the cabin, or at the creek, or in the space where a person used to be. You didn't put it down. Clara understood this now with her whole body. You just got stronger, and the getting stronger was invisible from the outside most of the time. And that was all right, because strength built in private was still strength. On a September evening, with the light going golden over the valley, and May in her lap, and Henry asleep in the house, with a stubbornness that suggested he intended to stay asleep for 12 hours and hold you to it, Clara sat on the step and watched Mercer mend harness leather in the yard, and thought about the question she'd been carrying for some time. "Do you think we're a family?" she said. He didn't stop what he was doing. He worked the needle through the leather, pulled it through, considered. "What do you think?" he said. "I think you keep doing that," she said, "asking me what I think when I ask you something." "Because you usually know what you think," he said. "I'm asking because I want to know what you think, not to find out my own opinion." He set the harness down and looked at her across the yard. The light was hitting him from the side, and he looked older in it, and also somehow more settled than she'd ever seen him. Not comfortable exactly, because Mercer was not a comfortable man, and she didn't think he ever would be, but present. Rooted in the particular way of something that has found the ground it was meant to be in. "I think family is what you do more than what you are," he said. "I think—" He paused. "I think it's less a thing you have and more a thing you keep choosing, every day, choosing to come back and fix the fence and write the letters and do the next thing." Clara looked at May in her lap, at the round face and the dark eyes that were going to be, Briggs thought, the same color as Ruth Whitlock's, a deep brown with something amber in them when the light hit right. At the small hands that had learned to grip with real purpose now. "Then yes," Clara said. "I think we are." He picked the harness back up. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." May made her sound, the vocal inventory, the checking in sound, and Clara said, "I know," the way she always did, and the valley went gold and then amber and then the particular blue of September evening, and the year turned quietly on its axis. She thought about what she would have said 6 months ago, on the cabin floor, in the blizzard, burning books. If someone had told her this was where she'd arrive, she didn't think she would have believed it, not because it wasn't possible, but because possibility had seemed very far from where she was, and very abstract, and she hadn't had the luxury of abstract. She'd had the floor and the fire, and 2 heartbeats to guard, and that was all. But here was the thing that she'd learned, the thing that felt true in a way she couldn't have articulated at 11, but could almost articulate now. At 12. At the far edge of a year that had taken more than most years took. You didn't survive hard things by being ready for them. You survived them by being present in them, by doing the next thing, and then the next, and not asking the total cost until you were through to the other side. And the people who helped you through were not always the people you expected or the people you would have chosen from a position of safety. They were the people who happened to be there, who saw the smoke from the chimney and followed their instincts, who asked what you thought rather than telling you what to think, who knocked before coming in even when you'd said they didn't have to. Compassion on the frontier didn't look like speeches or grand gestures. It looked like firewood. It looked like a tin of condensed milk. It looked like sitting up all night with someone else's baby against your chest because the baby was cold and you were the only warm thing in the room. It looked like letters that described the light on a mountain road at 6 in the morning. It looked like showing up. That was all it was. Showing up was almost everything. Clara sat on the step with May in her lap and watched the stars come out over the Montana Valley, one at a time, and then all at once, the way they always did here. You'd watch and there'd be nothing, and then you'd stop watching and look back and they'd be there, vast and indifferent and somehow exactly right, the way certain true things were, the way you only found them when you stopped looking for them. Henry, from inside, made the particular sound that meant he had reversed his decision about the 12 hours. Mercer stood without comment and went in, and Clara heard his voice, low, a little rough, talking to the baby in the way he'd developed of talking to them. Not baby talk, just regular talk, telling Henry about Gideon's opinion of the new road or the quality of the cedar up north or whatever practical thing was on his mind, treating the infant like a small person who deserved information. And Henry, who responded to being taken seriously the way most people responded to being taken seriously, settled. Clara stayed on the step a little longer. She stayed until May's eyes grew heavy and then closed, and the weight of the baby in her lap went from awake weight to sleep weight, which was different, heavier, more trusting, the weight of something that had decided the world was safe enough to be unconscious in. May Whitlock, who had been born in a drawer in a dying cabin in the worst week of January, who had been carried 15 miles through a blizzard, who had nearly not stayed, who had looked at the option of leaving and chosen, with the specific stubbornness of someone born to a family that had it in the bone, to do otherwise. Clara thought, "You are going to be something. I don't know what yet, but something." She thought, "We all are." She stood up, careful not to wake May, and carried her inside into the warm and imperfect house with the stove that ran hot on the left, and the window Mercer had replaced, and the floor she'd scrubbed on her knees, and the books, new books now, a shelf beginning to fill, because you rebuilt what was burned when you had the means and the time, and someone who understood why. And she laid May in her bed and covered her and stood in the room for a moment in the dark. She thought about her father's margins. She would never read them, and she had made peace with that, but she thought about them still. Those small, cramped notes a man made when something struck him, the record of a mind moving through ideas. And she thought, I'll write my own. I'll make my own record. Everything I've learned, and everything I've survived, and everything I've understood about what people do for each other when the cold comes in and there's nobody else. It would be a long record. She was 12 years old, and it was already long. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on because the evening was cool and she wanted tea, and wanting ordinary things, tea, warmth, the quiet sound of water heating, was itself a kind of healing, the healing that happened in increments so small you didn't notice until you looked back and saw how far you'd come from the floor of the cabin. Mercer came in from checking on the animals and sat at the table, and she put a cup in front of him without asking. And he took it without comment, and they sat in the kitchen while the house settled around them, and outside the September night did what September nights did in Montana, went big and dark and full of stars. And it was not a perfect thing. It was not a resolved thing in the way of stories that resolved cleanly. It was a going forward thing, an ongoing thing, the kind of thing that didn't end but changed, that asked something of you every day and gave something back in return. Not always in equal measure, not always on the schedule you wanted. Clara May Whitlock drank her tea and thought about tomorrow, the school, the babies, the fence post that needed attention, the letter she'd write to Dorothea about the summer, the slow, ordinary forward motion of a life that had been earned in a specific and irreversible way. She thought, this is mine, all of it, the hard parts and the warm parts and the parts that hadn't happened yet, all of it mine. She thought that was enough. She thought that was, in fact, everything.